Inside the grand palace of the Egmont Empire, our beautiful heroine stood silently by the window. Adele's long dark hair fell like a curtain behind her, and her gaze carried a strangely calm mystery. For someone about to walk away from an emperor, a title, and an entire empire, she was surprisingly unbothered, almost like she was checking the weather, not ending a marriage. Then came slamming footsteps. A handsome blonde man burst through the door, the emperor himself, looking completely frantic, as if she were about to run away with the crown jewels. One could almost feel the panic rolling off him as he demanded to know where she planned to go without informing him. Adele didn't bother answering. Silence, after all, was its statement. Karl wasn't having it. Grabbing her shoulders, he tried to force out the real question, the one that clearly haunted him. Was she going to that man again? Lionel Baldur? Even now, he couldn't grasp what truly mattered. Adele found it almost pathetic that he still clung to the wrong thing. For her, the issue was simple. She couldn't stand being near him anymore. Karl tried to assert himself. The emperor's wife belonged at the emperor's side, according to him. But Adele only laughed, not kindly, reminding him she was no longer the empress, because he had dethroned her. And even if he hadn't, she would have walked away eventually. She'd already decided to abdicate long before this confrontation. And so began the story of how she ended up here. The royal carriage had once carried Princess Adelheid Kotrov, Adele for short, across a rough road under a weak sun. She had been a formidable striker in the Kotrov Empire, the kind of woman who could single-handedly clear a tower. Those towers, mysterious gates crashing from the sky, spilled monsters into the world, and Adele specialized in destroying the core that kept them alive. Former crown princess, elite battle mage, walking weapon. Basically everything except a docile bride. She remembered the day she learned of the proposal from Egmont. Her mother had received the letter and immediately treated it like a blessing from the heavens. But when Adele didn't react positively, the empress looked almost offended. Leaning in with that cold, unmotherly tone, she brought up the wound Adele never stopped carrying. Lucio. Her younger brother's inevitable death was the burden her mother used against her every time she wanted control. If Adele had stayed, she would have become the future empress, but also the reason Lucio would die. And then came the guilt-tripping cherry on top. Adele had to think of her future children, think of their relatives, think of everyone except herself. Her very existence was a danger to the throne. So for the sake of their home and for the brother she could never save, Adele had no choice but to leave. And so the princess sat in the carriage holding a photograph of the man she would soon marry, Emperor Karl Ulrich Egmont. Blonde, handsome, new husband material, and apparently unfaithful. Because in the papers tucked with the photo was another document, one that calmly stated he already had a mistress named Diane Poitiers. Clearly, this is not a delightful start to any marriage journey. After leaving everything behind and crossing the rough sea, Adele arrived in a foreign land with no familiar faces. Her new role, empress of a nation she'd never stepped foot in, felt less like a blessing and more like a polished cage. Meanwhile, Karl studied her portrait from afar. He wondered why she wasn't smiling in it. Most princesses sent cheerful pictures, but Adele's cold gaze looked ready to judge him from another dimension. Even then, he could feel her presence in the picture. Strangely intimidating. It was obvious she wasn't coming to him as his woman, but as an empress fulfilling an obligation. A month later, her arrival stirred the entire order of knights. Lionel Baldur, second son of Duke Baldur, Minister of Defense, and commander of the knights, waited at the gate with his men. And the moment they spotted her carriage, they all bolted to welcome their soon-to-be empress. Inside the carriage, Adele heard the thunder of hooves. She asked her maid if they'd arrived yet. Sadly, this was only the first gate, still an hour to the second. Deciding that she'd endured enough sitting for one lifetime, she chose to change clothes. Lionel reached the carriage door, formally announcing his role and his intention to escort her. Yet there was no response from inside. The maid opened the door for him, revealing a young woman with black hair and striking golden eyes. Not in a dress, but in horseback riding attire. A princess who greeted him with calm confidence and introduced herself plainly, Adelheid Kotrov. Lionel introduced himself as well, though he was clearly thrown off. She explained that after 2 months sailing on a ship and being trapped in a stuffy carriage, she longed to ride a horse. Some knights protested, but Adele assured them she wasn't being reckless. She was simply a skilled rider, and judging from the way she handled the horse without hesitation later, that was an understatement. Lionel watched, quietly impressed. She wasn't bluffing. Upon reaching the next checkpoint, he gently suggested she return to the carriage. Appearing before the palace on horseback, in travel-stained riding clothes, would be inappropriate. Adele accepted the advice, thanking him for allowing her that brief freedom. Lionel found himself thinking she really was unlike any lady he'd met. Strong-willed, sharp, calm, and almost wasted on a political marriage. It was a pity, he thought, that such a remarkable young woman was destined to become the Empress of Egmont. Back in the imperial palace, Karl sat in his office going through documents when a servant announced that someone from the Ivory Palace had arrived. Diane was asking for him again, apparently in need of his help. At this point, even the palace staff looked like they expected this sort of thing. Over at the Ivory Palace, Diane sits before a table full of coronation crowns, holding one with a delicate frown. She looked like someone being forced to pick between pastries, except each pastry symbolized political warfare. Before she could decide, an unexpected figure entered. Duchess Elisabetta Ulrich Grande, Karl's half-sister and the only woman in the imperial bloodline. Her name was long, but her patience was famously short, so, for convenience, let's call her Liz. Diane asked what brought the Duchess to the palace so suddenly. Liz didn't bother with pleasantries. Instead, she questioned whether the crown Diane was holding had actually been entrusted to her by the Emperor, or whether Diane was simply helping herself to the imperial treasury. Diane casually explained she was choosing a coronation crown for the future empress. Liz found that laughable, and said as much. A concubine choosing the official crown for the emperor's bride. That was the kind of scandal Kotroff would write furious letters about. Picking up one of the crowns herself, Liz asked what Diane thought of her choice, and pointed out that a crown selected by the emperor's older sister was far more appropriate than one chosen by a mistress. But Diane wasn't intimidated. She laughed softly, then apologized with the kind of apology that wasn't an apology at all, and commented that Liz was the only divorced noblewoman in the empire. Traditionally, women with that status never participated in wedding preparations. The implication hung heavily in the air. Liz's expression shifted from annoyed to deeply offended, but before she could unleash her response, the emperor walked in. Perfect timing, perhaps, but unfortunate for Liz. Diane immediately turned on the fake waterworks. Karl's eyes snapped to his sister as he demanded an explanation. Liz had no interest in defending herself. She simply stated that Karl seemed to have nothing better to do than abandon state affairs and run after his mistress. Explaining anything would be pointless. He wouldn't believe her anyway. Karl then asked Diane why she was crying. With a trembling expression, Diane insisted nothing was Liz's fault. It was her own inadequacy. She said she simply wanted to help prepare for the wedding, but the Duchess disapproved. Liz practically choked at that. Diane once again painted her as the jealous older sister trying to torment an innocent flower. Meanwhile, Liz was expected to stand silently while Karl's mistress used the wedding as her stage. But Karl cut her off. He reminded Liz that their family had no suitable noblewoman to oversee the ceremony, so they should be thankful that Diane volunteered. Especially Liz. Liz caught the implication, because she was divorced, and she didn't appreciate it one bit. Karl warned her that this was his final warning. Respect Diane and do not stir trouble. Realizing she'd lose her temper if she stayed any longer, Liz announced she would leave for her territory immediately after the ceremony. Karl and Diane left the room, leaving Liz alone with her thoughts. She recalled Diane's previous words, that the Emperor was like the sun, blindingly powerful, and those closest to him shined the brightest. Even as his older sister, Diane wondered what right Liz had to upset him. Diane had declared herself the only moon in the Emperor's sky, and unfortunately for Liz, she really acted like it. Liz quietly wondered whether the new Empress would have any idea how to handle a woman like Diane. Meanwhile, in another quiet room, Diane gently stroked Karl's head while he rested on her lap. She admired every detail of him, as if he were a priceless sculpture. In her mind, he was hers alone, someone she would never willingly share with another woman. A tear slipped from her eye and landed on Karl's face, making him sit up in surprise. She told him she was worried the future empress might treat her poorly. Maybe she should leave the palace entirely. Karl soothed her concerns, assuring her that the empress would not harm her. Diane apologized again, saying she felt like she stood in his way. She called him her son, her entire world, and insisted nothing would change that, even if he married another woman. But inside, her thoughts were far darker. She would never let the empress take him away from her, no matter what. Later, as wedding preparations continued, Diane's brother Lennox visited her. He casually asked if she intended to choose the emperor's clothing next, but he couldn't help noticing she didn't look like someone whose lover was about to marry another woman. Before she could answer, Diane noticed a maid nearby. Soft blonde hair, deep blue eyes, ordinary features, yet apparently troublesome to Diane. She immediately dismissed the servants. Once they left, she told her brother she didn't want any maids with blonde hair and blue eyes near her again, and warned him to watch his words around them. Lennox pointed out that nearly half the palace staff shared those features. Removing them all would leave the palace empty. But Diane didn't care. When she drew a line, she expected everyone to obey. Dropping the topic, Lennox asked whether she was sure she could handle the empress. This wasn't some simple noblewoman. It was a royal princess from another empire. And if Karl couldn't live without Diane, why wasn't he making her the empress? In his view, any new empress would see Diane as a threat, and with good reason. Aside from that, rumor already had it that the future empress was extraordinarily beautiful. Lennox reminded her that this was exactly why he pushed her to conceive the emperor's child before the marriage. But Diane snapped that things weren't that easy. She insisted Karl would never give the empress real power, because he despised the very concept of an empress. She was certain he loved her, too much to make her his official empress. Lennox told her she clearly knew nothing about men. Love fades. Diane calmly agreed. Love for the living, yes, fades. But love for the dead, that stays untouched. Opening the locket around her neck, she gazed at a portrait inside. She said the emperor saw his mother in her, a woman who had died under the persecution of the former empress. That was why the title, Empress itself, created distance between them. In her mind, Karl would never love the woman who held that title. So why chase the throne? With a chilling smile, Diane declared she preferred being a concubine who possessed both love and influence, rather than an empress with nothing but a crown. The day after Adele arrived, the palace lined up a whole parade of nobles to greet her. It's their attempt to display their best political manners in front of the future empress. Yet despite all the formalities and smiling faces, one thing was impossible to ignore. The emperor never showed up. Not a word, or even a polite message. By the time the last guest finally left, Adele was exhausted. She asked for a hot bath and announced she'd meet anyone else tomorrow. A very reasonable plan, until the palace proved it had no intention of letting her relax. Because just moments after she settled into her room, Diane appeared without warning. Adele was in disbelief. It wasn't every day a random stranger strolled straight into a future empress's private quarters. Visitors were supposed to wait in the sitting room, not her bedroom. Yet here stood Diane, calm, confident, and undeniably out of place as she introduced herself. Adele instantly recognized her, though she pretended otherwise, turning her attention to her maid to dry her hair. Meanwhile, Diane quietly examined Adele from head to toe. And upon noticing Adele wasn't blonde with blue eyes, Karl's supposed type, she allowed herself a small smile of relief. A smile Adele definitely caught. Then Diane made her move. She politely asked to dry Adele's hair, but Adele immediately cut off the attempt, her expression turning sharp and unmistakably assertive. If Diane wasn't a servant, what exactly was she doing barging into the Empress's private room? Diane tried to sweeten her intrusion by claiming she simply wanted to share the Emperor's personal preferences, his likes, dislikes, and even how Adele should style her appearance. Apparently, he preferred curly hair and a touch of blush. Adele had absolutely no intention of tolerating such behavior. With no hesitation, she seized Diane by the hair, a reminder of who held the higher position now. Then she requested a drink, fully done with uninvited interruptions. If Diane truly had something to say, She could tell the Emperor directly about Adele's supposed preferences in men. For instance, Adele preferred men who spoke to her honestly and handled personal matters face to face. She also made it clear that she had no intention of reshaping herself to suit anyone else's tastes. So there was no reason for Diane to chatter about the Emperor's preferences at all. She could simply keep that information to herself. Then, she smoothly told Diane to leave. Diane tried to remain composed, wishing Adele a pleasant stay and offering future assistance. Before leaving, she ordered the servants to take good care of the future Empress, maintaining her usual facade of sweetness. Adele eventually learned that Diane wasn't just the Emperor's mistress, she practically ran the palace. And with the way everything was arranged, it almost felt as if Adele had wandered into the imperial residence by accident, rather than as the future Empress. When the maid brought her a silver crown to try on, the moment should have felt majestic, yet Adele disliked it instantly. She quickly requested a gold crown instead, and insisted it be changed before the wedding. Somewhere else in the palace, Karl noticed Diane's growing distress as the wedding ceremony approached. Karl wanted to protect her from the title of Empress, but at the same time, he wanted to do nothing with her. Whenever he hears the word Empress, it makes his stomach turn, which was the entire reason he had ignored Adele upon arrival. But that decision only pushed Diane deeper into emotional chaos. Just then, Diane commented on how the Empress is truly noble and beautiful. But to someone like Adele, it's only natural that she would appear merely as a common palace handmaiden. She spoke with fake tears, aware that the Emperor's birth mother had been a handmaiden to the former Empress, which made her understand how Karl would react upon hearing that. When Karl questioned her about her meeting with Adele, Diane claimed nothing happened, and that she simply couldn't explain her identity in front of Adele. It supposedly made her too sad. Soon she was crying, trembling, and struggling to breathe, prompting Karl to urgently summon a doctor. She begged him not to leave her alone, especially on that day. And as expected, when the wedding was supposed to begin, guests whispered restlessly. The Emperor still hadn't arrived for the ceremony, leaving Adele standing alone at the altar. The tension was thick enough to cut with a jeweled dagger. To Adele, it felt like being thrown onto a battlefield without armor. But she remembered an old piece of advice from her nanny: trust only yourself, and guard your dignity with everything you have. So Adele asked for a chair. The entire hall watched in stunned silence as she calmly sat down, waiting for her groom as if the spotlight were hers alone. Somehow, she made even a simple chair feel like a throne. People whispered that she must be incredibly confident, and frankly, they weren't wrong. Her beauty captivated the entire crowd, and in that instant, she shifted the atmosphere by simply existing. One of them finally gathered the courage to approach her, Duchess Grande, the Emperor's sister. She politely introduced herself, eager to greet the future Empress. Adele replied that she didn't yet know how to present herself, but once the wedding was over, she'd be able to do so properly. An old man also chimed in, introducing himself as August Ulrich Dispone. He smiled and declared that Adele could now confidently claim the imperial surname, Ulrich Egmont. But Adele was far from naive. With a single poised comment, she offered them a seat after they all introduced themselves. She subtly indicated where she stood in this hierarchy. From that moment alone, everyone understood. This Empress would not be easily overshadowed. At long last, Emperor Karl finally appeared, much later than any groom should. But when his eyes landed on Adele, even he faltered. She wasn't just a bride waiting at the altar. She looked every bit the Empress she was meant to be. Their first meeting, however, was ice cold. They were two strangers facing each other at their wedding, bound by duty rather than affection. Adele glanced at him with composed interest, noting he looked far better in person than in any portrait, but she couldn't understand why he looked coldly at her. He was the late one, not her. Meanwhile, a servant stepped forward, offered her the wedding bouquet, and another urged Karl to take his bride's hand, so the ceremony could finally continue. However, Karl refused. He turned away from her hand in front of the whole empire. A silent rejection that jolted the crowd and left several jaws hanging open. They still walked to the altar, though Karl seemed far more invested in revisiting the previous incident involving Diane. Adele maintained her composure, even while thinking about how absurd it was that a maid, or in this case, a mistress masquerading as one, had entered her private room without permission. Karl corrected her instantly, telling her Diane was not a servant, and he warned Adele to be cautious with her words regarding her. And right there, in the middle of the ceremony, he informed his bride that she shouldn't expect him on their wedding night. Nothing would happen between them. The priest continued as if none of that happened, announcing Adele as the new empress of the Egmont Empire, an unchangeable fact now that the vows were sealed. While Adele's first night as empress began in uneasy silence, Diane was staging her own tragedy. She had refused food for days, and the maids hovered nervously around her. One maid made the innocent mistake of commenting on how Diane seemed too anxious to eat. The poor girl instantly regretted it and apologized to Diane, but also called her "my lady." That's strike two for her. Diane quickly glares at her, making the maid fall to her knees, apologizing frantically to avoid punishment. Diane, who apparently considered herself the true mistress of the palace, grabbed the maid by the hair and reprimanded her with sharp cruelty. She demanded to be addressed as palace master, not merely a mistress or a usual noble lady, and dismissed the terrified servant with cold disgust. She was irritated by the incompetence around her. Then she told her remaining maid to fetch a doctor, insisting the entire palace believed she was too ill to rise from bed. Meanwhile, Adele understood the situation all too well. She was alone in unfamiliar territory, surrounded by people she couldn't trust, not even the servants. Relations between Egmont and her homeland had been distant for years, separated by a vast sea, giving her almost no information about the palace she now lived in. And Karl's complete disregard for his lateness at the ceremony only made the atmosphere heavier. Scoffing, Adele mutters to herself that there's a limit to how much humiliation she can bear. She's really frustrated, especially after realizing the possibility that her husband most likely stayed by his mistress on the very day of their marriage. News of Diane's declining health reached Karl quickly, and he changed direction immediately, rushing to her side. She lay on the bed, pale and fragile, with her maid explaining she hadn't woken properly and wasn't feeling well. Karl stood over her in his wedding attire, thinking of how much she resembled his mother, a detail Diane was very aware of and often used to her advantage. Everything that had been happening was part of her plan to further ruin the wedding, or his relationship with his empress. Now Diane softened her voice, apologizing tearfully for causing him trouble on his wedding day. She mentioned how she personally selected the wedding dress and crown, but decided not to complain further, so he wouldn't tire of her tears. Despite her emotional display, Karl's eyes remained cold. But Diane needed him to be more pliant. Therefore, she quickly asked how he planned to introduce her to the empress. The nobles would call her nothing more than a mistress. Karl, however, was a man she could manipulate. He had weaknesses that Diane knew how to use. So when he asked if she had a title on her mind, she requested to be introduced as his lover and drew close enough to take his hand, asking him to hold her. As the two lay in her bed, she whispered to herself that if she couldn't be his empress, she would at least make sure that the title lost its significance. After the wedding, society devoured the scandal like hungry wolves. It spread everywhere. The emperor had gone to the ivory palace on his wedding night, leaving the empress alone. Now everyone thought that Adele was no better than a mere concubine. When Adele walked near a group of noble women on one morning, their conversation halted instantly. They greeted her politely with smiles that were far too sweet, but Adele had already heard enough. Her hands tightened into fists, eyes flashing with quiet fury. She had expected whispers, but the harshness of their tones still stung more than she wanted to admit. She had come here alone, not taking a single familiar face with her. Partially because Egmont required it, but mostly because none of her people deserved to be dragged into exile alongside her. Living there, surrounded by strangers and cold whispers, Adele realized one truth very quickly. She was going to have to survive this empire on her terms. By tradition, the empire's grand wedding banquet took place on the third day after the ceremony, and at the Ivory Palace, Diane was busy preparing for it, though the only thing she was actively working on was deepening her resentment. While the servants scrambled around her, she drifted through her memories, back to the moment she lost her parents in a sudden monster raid from a tower. From that tragedy onward, she had clawed her way up with nothing but grit and ruthless determination. She earned a noble title, won the emperor's affection, and secured her residence in the Ivory Palace entirely through her own hands. So in Diane's mind, someone like Adele had no right to sit on a throne she herself had fought so hard to approach. And because of that belief, Diane made sure Adele wouldn't even touch that throne on the day of the banquet. In Diane's perfect version of events, everything tied to the Emperor, first night, first banquet, first grand entrance, should belong to her, not the foreign princess who legally held the title. While Diane plotted in her pretty little fortress of grudges, Adele was dealing with her own crisis. The banquet dress didn't fit the moment she tried it on, not even close. The maids winced as they apologized, explaining that the measurements sent from her homeland apparently didn't match the ones prepared in Egmont, and the only reason why her wedding dress was fitted to her simply because it was crafted by different tailors. When Adele instructed them to simply resize it, adding that being late to her own banquet wasn't the end of the world, the maids hesitated with that careful, overly polite tone that always meant trouble. Making a dress smaller was easy, but making it bigger was nearly impossible. Adele exhaled slowly, remembering her mother's warning, one she had brushed off back then. Her mother had always said that whether it was fighting monsters or climbing towers, she couldn't forget that palace politics were a battlefield of their own. A general in the wilderness could sleep easier than an empress who blinked at the wrong time. And here she was, realizing her mother had been painfully right. In Egmont, she couldn't let her guard down for even a moment. Faced with only two choices, miss her own banquet or wear a dress that didn't fit, Adele took a good look at the maids. She asked bluntly whether Diane had planned the whole wedding without the Emperor's permission. Their silence was answer enough. To Adele, the entire situation was absurd. Diane truly believed she could humiliate her with a small dress and the Emperor's temporary affection. But the problem was simple. Diane clearly had no idea what kind of woman she was dealing with. Adele wasn't just a princess. She was the witch of Kotrov. And she had survived far worse things than petty wardrobe sabotage. With that calm, unbothered authority that made her so dangerous, Adele instructed the maids to bring her the dress and the crown from the wedding ceremony. While Adele wrestled with her dress dilemma, the banquet itself was already thriving, and Diane, of course, had planted herself right at the center like she was born for the spotlight. Nobles flocked around her with the enthusiasm of bees to honey, showering her with praise for how magnificently she had arranged everything. Diane accepted the compliments with that polished, sugary smile she always used when she was pretending to be humble. She even tossed in a line about how she couldn't have done it without the Duke's help, which made the old man beam like she had handed him a medal. Other noble ladies circled her next, their eyes glued to her necklace and earrings. They excitedly commented on how her jewelry set was the newest release from the Empire's most renowned atelier. One woman confessed that she went to buy it for herself, only to be told that Diane had already purchased every single piece. As usual, the women quickly exchanged gossip. One noble leaned in and whispered that she heard the Emperor spent the night of his wedding at the Ivory Palace. Their faces lit up like they'd discovered a forbidden romance. For them, the event was the stuff love stories were made of, and apparently worth being jealous over. Diane was thrilled deep inside, though she put on a pitying face and said they shouldn't speak of such things because she felt sorry for the Empress. It was an act, all of it, but she loved every second of their admiration. These noble women, born into privilege, treated her with awe, measuring every word carefully, never daring to offend her. Their flattery made Diane's whole body buzz with satisfaction. It was intoxicating to her. Right in the middle of this mountain of compliments, Lennox strutted into the conversation and proudly declared that his dear sister still had the Emperor's permission to manage the palace freely. According to him, Diane practically had more authority than the Empress. Of course, he said it loud and proudly. Someone finally cut through his bragging with a calm but dangerously sharp remark. Lionel. The instant he spoke, every woman in the group turned toward him, dazzled by his presence. Lionel reminded Lennox why the banquet existed in the first place, and that if he valued his position even a little, he should watch his mouth. Lennox bristled instantly, puffing up like he was ready to start a fight right there. Diane panicked internally. The last thing she needed was her brother's brain-to-mouth problem blowing up her carefully crafted image. But just as tensions were about to spark, the entire hall shifted. All eyes moved to the entrance, because the Empress had finally arrived. Adele walked through the grand hall with the poise of someone who knew exactly who she was. Beautiful, composed, and quietly regal, she commanded attention without saying a single word. People couldn't help but stare. Most didn't even recognize that she was wearing her wedding dress. It was only Diane, now fuming beneath her polite expression, who recognized it immediately. Adele offered a small smile and apologized for being late, and that alone sent waves of admiration across the crowd. The way she carried herself was magnetic. And then she walked up the Emperor's stairs. No one had ever dared to do such a thing. But Adele did it naturally, like she was simply taking her rightful place. The nobles were stunned and deeply impressed. This reaction was not what Diane had prepared for. She had expected murmurs, judgment, maybe even mockery. Instead, she had to watch the crowd fall in love with Adele's grace and confidence right before her eyes. As soon as Adele fixed her gaze on the Duke, the old man nearly jumped to answer. He insisted he was thoroughly enjoying the banquet, and even added that he had been waiting for the Empress to join. One had to admire how fast the man switched teams depending on who shone brighter. Once Adele settled into her throne, a new problem popped up. Nobody wanted to be the very first to introduce themselves. It was the classic noble version of, "You go first. No, you go." Thankfully, Lionel stepped forward like the natural knight he was, greeting her along with the nobles from the Baldur dukedom. That broke the awkward spell instantly, and within seconds everyone began flocking around the Empress like it was their idea all along. Meanwhile, Diane noticed something unforgivable. Adele hadn't even looked her way. And for someone who thrives on being the center of gravity, that tiny detail stung. Still, Diane wasn't about to sit quietly and sulk when she could perform. So, she boldly approached and introduced herself, only to receive one of Adele's calm, polite greetings in return. With that first attempt falling flat, Diane switched tactics. She brought up the wedding preparations and the banquet, blatantly fishing for an emotional reaction. But Adele only stared back with that elegant, unreadable expression and delivered what could only be described as a graceful slap. She told Diane she was sure she had tried her best, then casually mentioned she couldn't wear the banquet dress because it was, unfortunately, too small. She even reassured Diane not to apologize since humans make mistakes. The nobles murmured immediately as they were connecting dots. It was obvious what everyone now suspected. The Mistress, and the color drained from Diane's cheerful facade. Right then, the Emperor arrived. Perfect timing to make everything worse, as always. The nobles stiffened, and Karl noticed immediately that Adele had once again taken control of the room without lifting a finger. It clearly bothered him. And worse, he saw Diane's tearful face. As always, Karl jumped to conclusions like it was his specialty. Someone made his beloved mistress cry, and the culprit was obvious to him. He demanded to know what Adele thought she was doing. Adele simply said she was greeting everyone. When he pressed about Diane's tears, she calmly suggested he ask his mistress himself. Diane's explanation was vague enough to avoid direct blame, but sharp enough to point Karl in the direction she wanted. He took the bait instantly, and when he walked to his throne, he passed Adele like she was invisible. Not that Adele gave him the satisfaction of reacting. She remained composed, as if she had expected nothing else, but Karl wasn't done embarrassing himself. He loudly declared that Diane was his lover, so Adele shouldn't mind her, and he added that he wouldn't interfere with Adele's lover either. The Emperor really said that in front of the entire empire. Adele laughed. Her signature, "I'm furious, but will not give you the satisfaction" laugh, and reminded him he should tell his lover to stop seeking her out. She also casually noted that she'd only met Diane twice, yet both times Diane approached her first. Of course, Karl acted like he didn't hear a word. Everyone watching assumed the Empress simply wasn't the type to get rattled. Lionel, who respected her more than most, believed she was unshakable. But deep down, he also knew she was always tightly keeping herself in check. And that night proved it. Because once Adele was alone, her composure cracked just enough for her emotions and her mana to spill over. Everything in her room trembled from the surge of power she could no longer contain. Between the too small dress, Diane's calculated digs, and Karl's public humiliation, she had every right to be furious. Still, she tried to push the mistress issue aside and focused on the real puzzle, the Emperor himself. Why was he so obsessed with Diane yet refused to make her empress? Why bring Adele all the way from a distant empire just to treat her like a nuisance? Maybe Karl thought he and Diane were some tragic star-crossed lovers. though Adele suspected his imagination was far too generous. Lying in bed, slightly drunk and exhausted, Karl's words echoed again, that she could have a lover too. The sheer unfairness made her want to scream. But then she remembered her father's teachings. Act as though you're always in control and never show weakness, because people smell vulnerability instantly. And that was the problem. Without Karl's approval, she was an empress by title only. Once everyone realized she held no true power, they'd swarm her like predators sensing blood. She needed a solution. And fast. Something solid enough to secure her position before the vultures gathered. The next day, Adele wasted no time. She needed to figure out who was actually running things inside the palace. When she asked her maid who handled important affairs, the answer came out a little too quickly. Diane. And before Diane, it had been Countess Hannah Giggs. The maid was sent running with 2 orders. Summon the Countess immediately and bring the latest edition of the Imperial Palace edicts. If the Emperor ignored his own Empress, then Adele would rely on the law instead. Anyway, according to the edicts, she did receive exclusive rights when she became Empress. Adele could practically feel her survival plan tightening like a corset. Necessary, uncomfortable, and absolutely something she couldn't take off. But before she could dive deeper, an unexpected guest arrived. It was Liz, the Duchess. She asked to speak privately, and Adele granted it. Over tea, Liz studied Adele with open curiosity. She noted that Adele was a bit shorter than she had imagined, but there was nothing fragile about her. If anything, Adele had a quiet dominance that made people straighten their backs instinctively. A useful aura to have in a palace full of opportunists. Liz then got straight to the point. Word had already spread that Adele called Countess Hannah. For nobles, this meant only one thing. The Empress intended to strengthen her position, and Liz warned her it wouldn't be easy. Diane had 2 big advantages: the Emperor's affection and Duc d'Espoin's influence. Practically everyone in the palace was supporting them. Adele didn't dance around it either. She simply asked what Liz hoped to gain if Adele managed to regain power. Liz admitted that her brother, the Emperor, was cornered between Diane and the Duke. Karl had power in name only, none of the actual authority a ruler should have. Liz hoped the Empress could become the bridge connecting Karl back to control. In short, if Adele stabilized her position, the whole empire would stabilize with her. Countess Hannah, Liz added, would be a strong ally. Then Liz's advice took a bolder turn. She said Adele should publicly announce that she was seeking an imperial aid. Traditionally, the Chamberlain was a woman, but the Empress's aides were typically men. Liz mentioned, almost casually, that whenever her father changed lovers, her mother simply increased her number of male aides. The implication was obvious. Adele couldn't help but giggle. If Karl had a mistress, then perhaps the Empress should have options. The nobles would certainly talk. But Liz quickly clarified. She wasn't telling Adele to actually commit adultery. Their empire cared deeply about appearances. What mattered was that Adele must not look weak. If she let Karl treat her like a decorative empress, the palace would view her as nothing more than an imperial concubine. And that was the one thing Adele absolutely couldn't afford. Liz then added one last interesting detail. If, by any chance, someone from the Baldur family applied to become her aide, she should accept immediately. The scene shifted to Countess Hannah Giggs, Adele's soon-to-be ally, and her backstory. Hannah had been Chamberlain for years through her connection with the previous Empress. She practically ruled the palace once. But everything shattered when Diane appeared, reminding Hannah painfully of the Emperor's birth mother, the woman who indirectly caused the previous Empress's death. When Karl became infatuated with Diane, the first thing the mistress did was drive Hannah out of the palace. Now, summoned by the new Empress, Hannah's emotions were overflowing. She cried the moment she stepped inside Adele's chambers. Everything here was exactly as the previous Empress left it, even the sofa, which she herself had chosen. But Hannah also believed that it was time for change, and that Adele deserved a fresh start. The Empress smiled and asked if this meant Hannah accepted her proposal. Hannah didn't hesitate. She pledged her loyalty wholeheartedly. Unfortunately, their progress was immediately interrupted. The new dress Adele ordered had arrived, but the Imperial Ministry of Finance refused to pay for it. The audacity was actually impressive. Her jaw tightened, but Adele hid her anger gracefully. Hannah calmly suggested that Adele pay from her private funds to avoid rumors, and even give the dress shop a generous tip to keep them silent. Adele didn't expect to use her own wealth this early, but clearly everyone in this empire was begging to be taught some manners. She handed Hannah a gold bar, telling her to use whatever was needed, and asked for Hannah's thoughts on how the dress payment incident even happened. Hannah explained that the Empress's palace had no allocated budget at all, because Adele wasn't present during the previous year's budgeting process. A convenient excuse and a very deliberate slight. When Adele asked if the situation was justifiable, Hannah admitted it wasn't. An emergency budget increase could be issued, but only with the Emperor's direct approval, meaning Adele would have to face her husband. So while Hannah handled the dress issue, Adele headed into her own battlefield, the Emperor's palace. When she arrived, servants informed her that Karl was in a council meeting. Since she insisted on speaking with him, they escorted her to the waiting room beside the conference hall. And as Adele took her seat, she had one more plan in mind. If she had to wait for the Emperor, she might as well listen in. Perfect time to learn what the council was plotting behind those closed doors. Inside the council meeting, the tension was almost suffocating. One of the noblemen all but threw himself forward, begging for strikers strong enough to destroy a growing tower, and keepers capable of holding off the monsters spilling out of it. According to him, people were dying as they spoke. Flying creatures had already emerged, and the portal kept expanding. But no one dared support his plea. To them, Count Calvin was just a country bumpkin noble exaggerating a minor problem. Lennox eventually chimed in, calling the Count's request excessive. In his eyes, the situation in Calvin's territory was only a level 4 tower, which meant there was no need to dispatch any imperial mages. But the Count insisted otherwise. Facing flying monsters meant the threat was far beyond a mere level 4. Then Lennox asked the one question everyone had been avoiding. What would they do if a first-level tower appeared right on top of the imperial palace? He pushed further, accusing the Count of being selfish, suggesting Calvin didn't care about the Emperor's safety and only wanted help for his own benefit. Sitting outside, Adele overheard bits of the discussion, enough to understand that a tower had appeared somewhere and people were desperately in need of a skilled striker. Lionel stepped in next, sounding far more reasonable. He argued that Count Calvin's lands needed immediate support. They had manpower ready, and the imperial magicians were conveniently inside the palace with nothing to do but wait. The Emperor cut in before Lennox could snap back again. Karl apologized to the desperate Count and promised he would consider the request, an empty formality that carried no hope. As the Emperor dismissed the nobles, a servant informed him that the Empress was waiting. The meeting dissolved quickly. Noblemen bowed politely as they passed Adele in the corridor. Karl still hadn't given any orders to send mages. If anything was going to move forward, someone else would need to act, and Adele already knew she'd have to speak with Count Calvin herself. But of course, drama arrived on schedule. The Duke suddenly appeared, loudly greeting her as "my dear lady." A pointed choice, especially when every man exiting the chamber could hear it. Adele instantly disliked the false warmth in his voice, while the Duke clearly enjoyed her discomfort. His apology sounded refined, the kind of tone used by someone who apologized often, and rarely meant it. Adele responded with her usual grace, suggesting he choose a more appropriate way to show friendliness next time, especially in how he addressed her. Lionel then approached and bowed. Curious, Adele finally asked who Count Calvin was, the man begging for help earlier. After introducing himself, Count Calvin repeated his concerns, and Adele admitted she had overheard the situation. The voices were loud enough to leak through the door. She understood how urgently he needed mages. Suddenly, Lennox joined the group as well, greeting the Empress with practiced courtesy as he introduced himself as the vice commander of the Mage Corps. Adele echoed what she heard inside. Did the Empire really classify towers with flying monsters as medium-level threats? Because it certainly sounded like Lennox had no intention of sending any mages to help. Confident to the point of arrogance, Lennox declared that he would personally protect the palace, and not a single monster would breach the walls. In truth, he was bluffing, and simultaneously looking down on Adele, assuming she was pretending to understand matters far beyond her knowledge. Before the conversation could continue, a servant informed Adele that the Emperor was ready to meet her. She bid the nobles goodbye with her usual calm composure. Lionel looked particularly captivated. For some reason, he simply couldn't tear his eyes away from the quiet authority she carried. Inside the room, Karl asked what was so urgent. Adele didn't hesitate, and finally asked the question she'd kept buried since the wedding. For what purpose did he marry her? Karl compared her presence to a feather attached to a quill, implying that her simply existing in the Empire fulfilled her entire purpose. Adele pressed him again. Was she expected to simply sit still and exist under the title of Empress? If so, why go out of his way to humiliate her? Then she touched on the subject Karl least wanted to confront, whether he feared she would harm Diane. When he didn't answer, Adele clarified she intended to fulfill her duties and hoped the Emperor would allow her to do so properly. She requested an aide to assist with palace affairs, and noted that she would normally consult the palace administrator. But Diane currently held the role. She also expressed her wish for Hannah Giggs, the former chamberlain, to return to service. Adele knew the Emperor had expelled Hannah, which was why she consulted him before formally appointing her. Eventually, Karl agreed to all her requests. Afterwards, she addressed the matter everyone else avoided. Her palace budget had not been allocated at all. Before leaving, she reminded him that additional financing was possible. One signature from him could resolve the entire issue. As Adele left, Karl's gaze lingered on her dress. The red gown symbolized the Empress's authority. As a child, he had always reached for the hem of that dress, but the previous Empress never acknowledged him. He grew up clinging to the only person who ever soothed him. The memory tightened in his chest, stirring old resentment and guilt. Forced to confront the truth that the budget was truly missing, so Karl summoned Diane. She arrived quickly. When Karl mentioned the missing budget for the Empress's palace, Diane froze, then swiftly shifted into her specialty: thin-voiced apologies. She tearfully claimed she completely forgot. Karl handed her a handkerchief, asking her to stop crying. She whimpered that the Empress would surely be furious at her now, and asked how she could possibly fix such a terrible situation. Her fragility echoed Karl's mother, and he could not ignore the resemblance. Karl informed her that moving forward, the Empress herself would oversee all authority in matters Diane previously managed. Unsurprisingly, Diane did not take this well. Later, Duke Balder spoke privately with his brother, Lionel. He explained that Duke d'Espone had planned to place a puppet empress on the throne, importing a princess from a distant empire. But he had clearly underestimated Adele. Baldur added that he finally understood why Adele's mother had sent her far away, while the new emperor in her homeland was only 14. If Adele had stayed, her commanding presence would have overshadowed him entirely. Lionel listened, but his mind wasn't lingering on politics. His thoughts drifted elsewhere, to the new empress who, ever since the day he met her, remained impossible to forget. Back at the Empress's palace, Hannah approached Adele, looking both nervous and determined. Adele asked whether she had already paid for the dress the merchants brought earlier. Hannah confirmed she had, but then hesitated before asking if Adele had personally chosen the dress she was currently wearing. Adele explained she hadn't, but her handmaidens had selected it. Hannah gently suggested ordering Adele a new one, not out of vanity, but necessity. The dress looked as though it had been inherited straight from the former empress. If Adele continued wearing it, she would only provoke the emperor. She considered her advice quietly. Hannah had served the former empress, and had been expelled from the palace by the emperor himself. Even if Adele didn't fully understand the reasoning about the dress, it seemed wiser to trust Hannah's instincts. Meanwhile, Diane sat alone in her dimly lit room, tears streaming endlessly down her pale cheeks. The humiliation still burned. How easily the emperor had stripped her of authority and handed everything to Adele. In Diane's mind, Adele was simply the lucky one, gifted everything from birth without ever lifting a finger. That belief festered like a fresh wound. The ivory palace, beloved by the emperor's late mother and generously gifted to Diane, was something she swore she would never surrender. She refused to give up either the emperor or her place. With renewed bitterness, she ordered her maid to bring her the imperial budget papers. Clearly, she intended to ensure Adele never forgot her proper place, a decorative empress, at least in Diane's eyes. Back in the reception room, Count Calvin waited anxiously for his audience. Adele entered with a regal stride, took her seat, and immediately asked when the tower had appeared, how large it was, and how fast the monsters had begun emerging. The Count explained they had no mages in the region. Locals were forced to fight terrifying creatures with their bare hands while waiting for help from the central region. Help that could take days to arrive, even for a second-level portal. In short, bureaucratic delays were condemning ordinary people to die. Her expression darkened. Adele understood this pain too well. Back in her homeland, she had desperately tried to save commoners from similar disasters. But her mother had always told her, one person cannot save everyone. That disagreement had been the first crack in their relationship, the same crack that ultimately cost her the title of crown princess. Still, she listened as Calvin thanked her for her concern. He needed to return home immediately, and she agreed. Adele instructed him to evacuate all civilians to the nearest safe zones. Dungeons and caves were the best defenses against flying monsters. Children and elders must be moved first. She also urged him to negotiate with neighboring territories for emergency assistance. Then, at her signal, Hannah handed him a heavy bag of gold bars. Adele offered it as payment to secure alliances and aid. With her limited authority, it was the best support she could give. Later that day, Lionel and his older brother waited in their office, wondering why the Empress had summoned Count Calvin. The Duke remarked that he was surprised the Emperor had abandoned the Count, especially given Calvin's long-standing loyalty to the royal family. Lionel called it absurd that the Emperor would so easily turn his back on his own people. Their conversation stopped when Count Calvin arrived. Lionel immediately asked what had happened after seeing the man on tears. Calvin explained everything truthfully, still clutching the gold Adele had given him. He expressed deep gratitude, especially after the Duke handed him another pouch of money, and all he wished now was to return to his family before things worsened. The two brothers watched Calvin leave in stunned silence. Adele had given away her own gold to save ordinary citizens, a noble act from someone with almost no support in the Empire. As for Adele, she wished she could have done more for the poor Count. Hannah gently remarked that Adele had already done the best she could within her current limitations. The reminder settled heavily. Yes, this was her limit for now. She remembered what her mother once told her. You are intelligent, but the world is built by the intelligent and seized by the wise. So, you must always be wise, Adele. There was a reason she endured insults and slights in silence. There was a reason she could offer only a few coins instead of sweeping solutions. The problem was simple. She had no real power. So, what was the wisest way for Adele to gain power in this empire? Her next step became clear the moment Hannah advised her to request an audience with the Emperor. After all, as long as she remained in the Empire, maintaining good relations with Karl was essential. With Hannah's help, Adele prepared herself. They chose her attire carefully, styled her hair, and polished every detail. The result was breathtaking, a vision of elegance and quiet strength in a blue dress, ready to face the Emperor once again. When Karl saw her that night, he actually paused. Her gold-colored eyes, softly defined red lips, flawless skin, and the elegant line of her collarbones. Adele looked different today. He asked why she had come at such a late hour. Adele gently suggested they could share dinner if he hadn't eaten yet. But Karl brushed that aside completely, demanding instead to know why she had summoned Count Calvin earlier. He had sent the man away himself, deeming the dying county unworthy of effort. So, hearing that the Empress not only met Calvin but even gave him gold, it irritated him. He couldn't tell whether she was trying to be noble or simply pretending. Adele calmly explained that she only asked for information about the crisis, and she gave Calvin a small sum solely to evacuate civilians. It wasn't an act of rebellion. It was compassion. Karl stepped closer and whispered that she should keep her eyes and ears closed, that she should think only of pleasant things and ignore the chaos outside, as if empathy were somehow a flaw. Adele didn't back down. People were suffering and she couldn't pretend otherwise. To the Emperor, it sounded as if she now considered his people hers, despite having never met any of them until she became Empress. Adele's stomach churned as she forced her anger under control. Then, without warning, Karl lifted a lock of her hair, studying her as though she were a stranger. Leaning closer, he inhaled the faint sweetness of her perfume. For a moment, he seemed genuinely captivated, and thought to himself, was this really the woman who could seize control over a room with a single glance? But when his eyes met hers again, displeasure was clearly written across her face. Even so, he didn't retreat. Instead, he suggested that since she had come so late at night, they should finally make up for their lost wedding night. He even said that if she asked him to hold her, he would do so. Then he whispered for her to close her eyes and leaned in to kiss her. Adele couldn't bear it. She tried to pull away, smacking his hand aside, but he only grabbed her wrists, tightening his hold. He reminded her that he knew she had once been her empire's crown princess. And yes, she had the eyes of an emperor, but this empire belonged to him. He warned her that he preferred obedient women and ordered her not to meddle in his affairs again. Moments later, Adele walked out shaking with fury. Her vision blurred, her steps unsteady. The worst part wasn't his arrogance, it was her own powerlessness. And right then, of all the people she wished to avoid, Diane appeared. She quickly noticed her trembling. Adele told her to step aside, but Diane leaned in with venomous curiosity, whispering how Adele had followed her beauty advice, yet still had no luck with the Emperor. Now, according to her, Adele was simply running from her own mistakes. Adele hurried away the moment Diane turned to leave. The palace suddenly felt suffocating. Everywhere she looked, someone wanted her gone. She rushed down the stairs, desperate for a quiet corner to steady herself. But in her haste, she nearly slipped, only to collide with Lionel. He caught her firmly. When their eyes met, something in his expression softened. But after she thanked him for catching her, the Empress quickly excused herself. Lionel watched her go with worried eyes. The Empress, who always carried herself with calm confidence, looked nothing short of devastated. He then glanced down at the hand that had caught her, feeling almost as though it were still burning. By the time Adele returned to her room, Hannah rushed to her side, instantly sensing something was wrong. But Adele only asked to be left alone. All she wanted was a hot bath and silence. Once alone, she remembered something her nanny once told her. Follow your noble heart and do what you must, regardless of the outcome. That will be your path. The memory grounded her. She needed to grow her influence and power, even if the Emperor stood in her way. With a sigh, she muttered bitterly about her terrible marital luck. The fortune teller had once said she was blessed with good fortune, marital, parental, and child luck. Clearly, that charlatan had fabricated everything. By the next mealtime, Adele ate quietly while Hannah seemed deep in thought, worried that the Empress had been deeply hurt by both the Emperor and Diane, something she had learned from a maid that morning. But out of nowhere, a servant arrived, handing Hannah a document. It was the finally approved additional budget. Hannah presented it to Adele, who immediately asked where it had come from. The servant replied that it was from the Ivory Palace, meaning Diane had personally approved the amount. It was humiliating enough that an empress had to rely on a mere concubine for an emergency budget increase. But what made it worse was the amount itself, insultingly small. So, she quickly requested the rest of the palace budget documents. And when Hannah returned with the official account books, Adele almost laughed in disbelief. Her budget was so tiny it couldn't even buy a single horse. Worse, the funds currently allocated to the Ivory Palace were supposed to belong to the Empress's palace. Adele knew exactly whose hands had shaped that insult. It was only natural for Adele to send the document back for correction, but the speed of the reply said everything. Diane was still handling all the additional budget request, as if nothing had changed. She immediately ripped the paper in her hand and told the poor servant to go back and request yet another revision. When Diane received the second request, she sighed dramatically, muttering that the Empress simply wanted to indulge her taste for luxury. For Diane, the money she sent was already more than enough for Adele. Then, with her usual flair for acting, Diane asked her maid to fetch her most modest dress for her audience with the Empress. At the same time, she sent another maid running to the Emperor with a message. The Empress had summoned her over a budget increase, and Diane was trembling in fear. Meanwhile, Adele was hunched over the legal code, studying every line like a student preparing for a life-or-death exam. Thankfully, the law was very clear. The Empress had exclusive authority to decide who may reside within the imperial grounds. Since the Emperor controlled the additional funds, Adele couldn't dispute that part. But this clause, at least, was in her favor. Even so, Hannah still worried. Imperial edicts were a double-edged sword, useful, but dangerous enough to slice back. Still, Adele found it almost comedic that she now had to beg the Emperor's concubine for money that was originally hers, especially since Diane had added a single silver bar to the budget like she was donating charity. That alone made Adele clench her teeth. If anyone had swung the sword first, it was Karl, and Adele had been cut one too many times already. So she asked Hannah how to handle it. Hannah suggested retrieving the related documents and reissuing the order. Adele agreed, then added that she wanted to check Diane's residency permit for living in the Ivory Palace. According to imperial law, empresses gained power in 3 ways: family, childbirth, or political influence. Family support was out of the question. Adele had practically been exiled by her own mother. Producing an heir was also impossible, especially after the Emperor himself once told her to simply ask if she wished to be held by him, an offer she had no intention of accepting. That left only one viable path. Adele needed to hire an aide and strengthen her own foundation. Just as she was planning her next steps, that familiar feeling of danger flickered nearby, as if a tower had suddenly appeared. But when Adele glanced sharply at the sky, everything looked normal. Then a maid hurried in, announcing that Diane was requesting an audience. Afterwards, Diane entered looking deceptively angelic in her plain dress. But Adele knew better. Sometimes the sweetest packaging hid the sharpest fangs. The Empress asked whether Diane had brought a response about the additional palace funds. Diane looked at her with practiced innocence, as if she had no idea why Adele looked displeased. When Hannah laid out the documents showing the Ivory Palace budget, Diane instantly realized that Adele was using her authority, both properly and under pressure. Adele had only one simple question. Why had the Ivory Palace never submitted any financial reports when every other institution had? Adele pointed out that all other royal departments detailed every purchase and wage payment, yet the Ivory Palace submitted only total expenses, with zero explanation of how the money was used. Nervously, Diane asked why the Empress was suddenly questioning the Ivory Palace budget. Adele calmly explained that she needed to transfer the funds from the Ivory Palace back to the Empress's palace. At that very moment, Diane's maid wasted no time sprinting to the Emperor. She breathlessly exaggerated that the Empress had summoned Diane, and that the concubine was terrified. She dramatized the story so much that Karl felt his throat tighten with panic. Back with Adele, she continued explaining that because Diane had been performing the Empress's duties in Adele's absence, she was allotted those funds as compensation. But now that Adele was fulfilling her role, it was only natural the money be returned. With a polite smile, Adele thanked Diane for her service and added that she wouldn't ask Diane to write detailed spending reports. Adele would review everything herself, and Diane only needed to return the entire budget. Inside, Diane was seething. A stranger had returned and was taking back everything she had controlled. She had grown comfortable running the palace in Adele's absence, and she hated losing her grip. She clenched her hand tightly, reminding herself that everything had been hers first. Adele knew exactly what Diane was feeling. It was the same crushing loss she felt when her mother revoked her position as crown princess, when all her power disappeared overnight. So, Adele asked whether Diane blamed her for losing her palace authority, but Diane kept her mouth shut. Adele told her to listen carefully. She reminded Diane that she was the Empress now, and Diane should never have challenged her. No matter how hard she clawed, Adele would never let her overstep again. In Adele's mind, as long as Diane didn't challenge her authority, she was willing to let Diane keep as much as possible. That was the most kindness Adele was prepared to offer. Their tense conversation was abruptly interrupted when the Emperor stormed into the room. Clearly alarmed by the exaggerated report, he looked ready to scold someone. He immediately demanded to know what was happening. That was Diane's cue. She collapsed to the floor dramatically, bursting into tears and begging for forgiveness. The performance was so convincing that even Adele had to blink. Diane stayed on the floor, sobbing pitifully, refusing to stand, even when Adele pointed out that they had been having a perfectly normal conversation moment earlier. Diane's maid rushed in like she was auditioning for Most Devoted Servant of the Year, frantically comforting Diane, who, to be fair, was performing the victim role so flawlessly she could probably win an award for it. Since neither of them would be able to explain anything clearly with Diane crying on the floor, Karl ordered a maid to escort Diane back to the Ivory Palace at once. Now fully angry, Karl turned to Adele and demanded an explanation. He insisted he had witnessed her enjoying herself while bullying poor Diane. Adele didn't even bother pretending otherwise. She simply told him the truth. The moment he entered the room, Diane had thrown herself to her knees and begged as if her life depended on it. Naturally, Karl refused to believe her. In his mind, sweet, gentle Diane could do no wrong. He even suggested that Adele must be jealous and trying to take what belonged to his mistress. That was when Adele realized the actual problem. Karl was the one who didn't respect rules. Diane was only following the freedom he allowed. Clearly, he had never even reviewed the proposed budget increase for the Empress's palace, since he had left all financial authority in Diane's hands. She showed him the pitiful amount allocated to her palace and asked how she was expected to run anything with that. She hadn't summoned Diane out of spite. She simply wanted the budget revised, and Diane had personally chosen to appear before her. But no matter what Adele clarified, Karl insisted that she had summoned Diane intentionally. Then, in a moment of pure audacity, he remarked that Adele's mother had promised him an obedient, quiet bride. He even mocked her exile, asking whether she had learned nothing from being banished from her homeland. Adele shot back that he knew nothing about the reason she had to leave, and warned him to choose his words carefully. Enraged, he grabbed her by the shoulders and told her to sit quietly like a flower in a vase, or she would end up in serious trouble. The nerve of this man was truly remarkable. Their heated confrontation came to an abrupt stop when a familiar chill raced through Adele. She sprinted toward the balcony and saw it. The sky turning red, thunder rolling violently, all signaling the descent of a tower. Hannah rushed in next, shouting that the Empress must hide immediately. Tower-born monsters were about to breach the palace, but the Empress remained calm despite the chaos, insisting she would stay. Outside, Lionel was already shouting orders, preparing the knights for battle. If the tower touched the ground, monsters would erupt from within. They had to hold the line until the magicians arrived, whenever that might be. Because realistically, the mages often showed up only after half the knights were already gone. In fact, even after a knight was dispatched to the Mage Corps to request urgent support, Lennox, the vice-captain of the Magician Order and a high-ranked striker, was not cooperative. When the knight begged him to gather the mages at the Rose Garden where the tower would land, Lennox shrugged him off, saying he followed only the Emperor's orders, not the Minister of Defense. The knight tried reasoning with him, but Lennox simply warned him not to use that tone. They desperately needed his help, yet Lennox behaved like the palace's biggest headache, unbothered by the number of people who could die. Out of options, the knight swallowed his pride, bowed despite being a noble and a knight, and pleaded for Lennox's support. And just like his sister, Lennox seemed almost thrilled whenever people begged. Back at the palace grounds, Lionel watched the tower descend and accepted the truth. The mages wouldn't arrive in time. He would likely have to face this thing alone. That's when the Empress appeared. She stepped forward, dressed in a sharp black suit, not at all like the fragile ornament Karl believed she was. Lionel was stunned and immediately tried to shield her, urging her to run to safety. But Adele grabbed his arm and asked the real question. Where were the mages? And why had no one destroyed the tower before it reached the ground? Flying debris suddenly whipped past them, forcing Lionel to draw his sword. He again demanded she hide behind him, but a sudden burst of magic stopped the debris midair. Lionel's eyes widened. He turned, expecting to see the mages, but they were still far away. So whose magic had that been? While Lionel tried to piece it together, Adele calmly assessed the situation. A fourth-level tower was forming, dangerous but manageable. She even remarked that she could handle it. Then she pulled out a sword with absolute confidence, a sight that nearly made Lionel's heart stop, and charged straight toward the tower. Lionel shouted after her that the updraft would sweep her away. His hand brushed her hair as he reached out, and in that brief contact, he realized the truth. The magic came from the Empress. Adele simply told him not to worry, and not to interfere before leaping directly into the violent vortex surrounding the tower. Lionel panicked, shouting for the knights to brace themselves and prepare to catch her when she fell. That's when Lennox also arrived and assumed Adele had been pulled upward by the updraft. Even he urgently ordered the mages to create a full magical barrier to ensure they could catch the Empress when she descended. Everyone looked up and then froze. Something strange was happening at the top of the tower. A deafening crack split the sky open as the entire tower suddenly erupted in blazing fire. As he watched the scene, Lionel finally understood why the Empress had been so confident earlier. Her fitted training attire, the sword mounted on her back, and the powerful magic that had pushed him away when he tried to stop her. And now he knew why. She was a mage, and a powerful one. As if confirming his realization, Adele emerged from the scattering remnants of the tower, freely descending through the sky looking completely unharmed. For Adele, the view from above after destroying a tower was something she found genuinely beautiful. Even back in her homeland, no matter how often she was scolded for this reckless hobby, she had never once intended to stop. In her eyes, this was her purpose. Once the tower had exploded into pieces, it was time for her to come down, quite literally. Lionel waited below, staring up like a man watching a falling star, holding out both arms as if ready to catch her. It was a commendable effort, but Adele didn't need it, because she could land flawlessly without anyone's help. When she touched down, she immediately asked if Lionel had intended to catch her in his arms if she fell. And once he admitted yes, she calmly warned him that a knight needed his arms to wield his sword. If she had crashed into him, he could have been severely injured. In her thoughts, many had criticized her for destroying towers in the past, but no one had ever run to her with open arms afterward. That made Lionel's gesture strangely touching. So, Adele smiled at him, genuinely, and thanked him not only for his effort today, but also for helping her yesterday on the staircase. For a moment, Lionel wondered how someone who looked so gloomy the day before could now smile with such warmth. As Adele walked past, she glanced at Lennox with a sweet smile and told him he could put away his sword now, since it was no longer needed. Of course, Lennox silently cursed to himself. The realization that Adele was not just a mage but a powerful one clearly bruised his ego. Anyway, Adele looked perfectly fine, at least on the surface. Even when she reached her room and Hannah rushed to her in a panic, she kept herself composed. But a few seconds later, her strength finally gave out. She collapsed onto the floor, and Hannah's terrified scream echoed through the hallway. Moments later, the entire empire buzzed as if someone had set the gossip market on fire. Everyone was raving about how the Empress had literally flown into the sky and obliterated a tower on her own, and how she somehow looked even stronger than Lennox. Lionel, meanwhile, was unusually quiet. His mind kept circling back to that striking image of her descending in that suit, fierce and breathtaking. The scene replayed in his head like something he didn't dare to forget. On the other hand, Lennox was furious and panicking. He stormed into the Duke's office and practically shouted that the Empress was an actual mage, and a powerful striker at that, who had destroyed a tower single-handedly. The Duke merely smirked, clearly cooking up some scheme, while Lennox sulked in the corner, annoyed that Adele had stolen the spotlight he wanted for himself. Still fuming, Lennox barged in next to Diane's room without knocking. He demanded to know why she wasn't pregnant yet. She scolded him, reminding him that she couldn't just decide to conceive on command. That was when he bluntly revealed the truth that Adele was a powerful striker mage. Diane immediately understood that it must have been Adele who removed the tower, making her wince in frustration. She had been hoping the new Empress would be an ineffective little doll, easy to dismiss. But now, a mage of all things. Lennox added that the Duke backing them both seemed far too impressed with Adele for comfort. For the first time, he was genuinely anxious that the old man might decide they were no longer useful. But Diane tried to calm him. She reminded him that if the Duke could replace Lennox easily, he wouldn't have recruited him in the first place. And besides, there was nothing to fear, even if the Empress was a mage, because Lennox was still the strongest striker in the Empire. She advised him to compose himself and focus on managing the mage corps while she continued tending to the Emperor. In her mind, they had endured too much to reach this point. A small complication like this wasn't enough to shake their position in the palace. As for destroying the tower on her own, Adele later dismissed the feat as nothing more than reckless bravado. Towers were sources of magic, and the moment one vanished, all the power that had surged through her simply drained away. With that magic abruptly torn from her body, she was left completely exhausted, and now lying on her bed. and amid the commotion that followed, Hannah quietly handed a servant a sealed letter addressed to Duchess Grande, an urgent message she refused to leave in ordinary hands. As for the Emperor, he acted strangely calm the entire time. In his mind, destroying a tower of that level wasn't even alarming. He had planned to send someone to handle it quickly. To his surprise, he didn't have to lift a finger. His Empress had already taken care of it, alone. Sitting in thought afterward, Karl realized he knew almost nothing about Adele beyond her name and gender. He even suspected her mother had sent her away because she couldn't control her. That suspicion alone pushed him to order a secret investigation into Adele's past during her time as a princess in the Kotrof Empire. The next morning, Hannah visited the Empress expecting to find her bedridden. Instead, Adele was awake, refreshed, and looking perfectly fine. Smiling, Adele told Hannah she planned to announce a recruitment notice for a personal aide, an unmarried man over 20, and to immediately disqualify if he had a fiancé. Adele would conduct the interviews and select him personally. The announcement spread through high society like wildfire, and even the Baldur Duchy wasn't exempt. When Duke Baldur wondered aloud whether the Empress was strengthening her influence or preparing for rebellion, Lionel gave no clear answer. He was still processing everything in his head. But one thing was obvious. Whoever became her assistant would instantly be rumored to be her lover. After all, the conditions stated that the Empress had to find the applicant pleasing to hire him. Michael, the Duke's assistant, even suggested they seize the opportunity. He recommended choosing someone tied closely to the Baldur family, capable of restraining the Emperor's authority while acting as the Empress's aide. He also reminded them that past aides were usually second or third sons of noble families, disposable enough not to cause political chaos, and tolerant enough to withstand being whispered about as the Empress's lover. Lionel calmly analyzed everything. He pointed out that the Empress's goals were already clashing with the Mage Corps' interests. Duke Baldur or Theseus didn't immediately understand where Lionel was heading with this, so Lionel spelled it out that he intended to become her advisor himself. Theseus nearly choked. Lionel? Serving the Empress? In his eyes, it made zero sense. People would gossip endlessly, Lionel's reputation would plummet, and he'd gain nothing. But Lionel remained firm. With everything happening, they no longer had room to retreat. Just like yesterday when Lennox refused to cooperate and was deliberately delaying reinforcements, yet Lionel couldn't even file a proper complaint, despite being Minister of Defense. Lionel then explained that the Empire's biggest threats were precisely those three things: towers, mages, and monsters. Their biggest problem was that they knew nothing about them. But with Adele's help, he was certain gaining that knowledge would be invaluable. Though Theseus wasn't thrilled at the idea of a Baldur son becoming a mere royal aide, he had no real argument against it. Eventually he agreed, and Lionel smiled. Unfortunately, Michael raised one glaring concern. What if the Empress didn't choose Lionel at all? After all, Lionel and Theseus were speaking as if Adele had already accepted him. Michael's honesty earned him nothing but a synchronized glare from both siblings in the end. On the flip side, Diane was sitting stiffly in the Emperor's office, and this was the first time they'd faced each other since the mess at the Empress's palace. The air felt a little awkward, like they were both pretending nothing happened while knowing exactly what happened. Karl then mentioned she didn't need to force herself to be here. If she felt unwell, she could rest in her chambers. It was the kind of polite dismissal that sounded gentle on the surface, but very much meant, "You can go." Instead of leaving, Diane brought up what everyone in the entire empire was buzzing about. The Empress had barely been married a month and was already looking for an aide. Diane wondered if this would cause trouble for him. On the outside, she looked genuinely concerned. Inside, she was hoping he'd throw the Empress under the carriage a little. Karl, however, wasn't bothered at all. He told her not to worry, and the moment she heard that, Diane's eyes misted up. She turned away dramatically, annoyed by his response. But the Emperor immediately followed it up by telling Diane that he didn't want to hear any more complaints about the Empress's request for a budget increase. That hit her like a slap. Diane always felt like Karl was her heaven one moment, and her personal hell the next. And right now, he was switching between both faster than she could blink. Once she left, Karl told his aide to give him the update on the Empress's aide recruitment. Since the announcement only went out that morning, he didn't expect much yet. But the aide reported that 16 people had already applied. Sons of major families were apparently swarming the opportunity like bees chasing anything sweet. Surely some of them didn't even know what the job was. They just heard Empress's aide and sprinted. Karl's real concern, though, was the Duchy of Baldur. He specifically asked if anyone from that family had shown interest. So far, none. Still, just to be safe, he told his aide to keep a close watch and inform him the second anything changed. Karl assumed that neither Duke Baldur nor his younger brother would apply in person, but he was sure they would send someone connected to them. Meanwhile, over at the Empress's palace, Hannah was taking the aide selection process way more seriously than anyone else in the Empire. She had just finished studying a full report on the Empire's political figures, and Adele couldn't help but praise how sharp she was. It made sense why the former Empress had treasured her so much. Still, after looking over everything, Adele came to the same conclusion every sane person would. The safest choice was someone from the Baldur family. And then the first interview began. The door opened, and the first young man practically floated inside like he was meeting a goddess. He immediately called Adele an angel, piling on sweet compliments so thick I wanted to hand him a towel. Adele just stared at him, remembering how in her homeland she was known as the Witch of Kotrov. An angel? Sure, maybe for someone who didn't know her. The second candidate wasn't any better. He nervously confessed he'd forgotten everything he prepared, acting like he'd walked into a dream. To Adele, it felt more like a nightmare, and she was wide awake for this one. After that, the parade of chaos continued. Each applicant tried to show off some ridiculous skill that had nothing to do with actual work. Adele was mentally tapping out. So eventually, she begged them to stop before she genuinely lost it. She collapsed onto the sofa, completely drained. Not a single candidate understood her purpose. None of them came to work. They came chasing a fantasy. But she knew she didn't have the luxury to quit halfway. So when Hannah offered to send everyone home, Adele refused. She wanted this interview to end today, so she insisted the rest be sent in quickly so she could finish and finally rest. The interviews dragged on, each one more hopeless than the last, until the next person walked through the door, Lionel Baldur. The moment he appeared, the other applicants instantly froze. Then, whispering broke out immediately. They wondered if Lionel even knew the rumor floating around that whoever became the aide would naturally become the Empress's lover. Of course, that was the real reason they'd all shown up. None of them cared about paperwork or responsibilities. They just wanted a shortcut to romance. And now that Lionel, handsome, competent, and basically unbeatable, walked in, they all knew the game was over. Back at Adele's side of the room, she couldn't figure out why the last few candidates suddenly lost all their confidence. Their energy totally died off. But even without that, none of them fit what she needed, and she felt she'd wasted an entire day. Just when she thought she could finally breathe and declare the interviews done, Hannah stepped forward and announced, "One more candidate has arrived to nominate himself." A few minutes later, Lionel walked into the office, and the whole energy in the room shifted. Adele's sharp, steady gaze landed on him, and he could instantly tell she wasn't doing this for fun or attention. Once he sat down across from her, he went straight to the point. He asked if she needed supporters, people loyal to her, and whether that was the real reason she'd opened the aide position. He wasn't wrong, because he knew she was alone in the palace with no one she could fully trust. And without holding back, he said that no matter who else applied, none of them would ever be a better option than him. It was bold, but honestly, the confidence fit him. Adele then asked how she was supposed to address him, as a knight or a minister, and Lionel simply told her she could call him however she wanted. But Adele wanted to make sure he was serious. If he wanted, he could have easily sent someone from his house to take this position, someone who would assist him behind the scenes. Instead, he came personally. Lionel didn't dance around the truth. He admitted openly that what he really wanted was the information Adele held about the towers. To him, that information was worth more than the status he'd lose by becoming her aide. That actually made sense, and Adele could see he wasn't lying. Satisfied, she smiled a little and addressed him by name. Before revealing what she was truly planning, she wasn't just looking for someone to help her with paperwork. She was preparing to build an entirely separate alliance in the palace, something strong enough to counter the existing power groups. And for that to work, he would have to pretend to be her lover. They would need to look close, speak casually, and act familiar enough that no one questioned their bond. She checked if he understood exactly what he was signing up for. Lionel accepted everything without flinching. He didn't care about rumors or whatever assumptions people might make. None of that mattered to him. And in that moment, Adele realized that she had finally found the perfect aide. That same day, news traveled fast. The moment the palace confirmed that Lionel Baldur himself had applied to be the Empress's aide, it reached the Emperor in less than a heartbeat. The Emperor's expression alone was enough to make the entire staff rethink their career choices. When Karl asked if Adele had already picked Lionel, his aide practically whispered that he wasn't sure. The Empress hadn't made anything official yet. Karl didn't say much, but his mood said everything. A little later, he stepped onto the balcony. His mind wandered back to something completely different. Adele's scent. That faint sweetness he'd caught before. It clung to him more stubbornly than he'd ever admit. His thoughts dragged him back to the day she came to share a meal with him. He kept wondering what would have happened if she'd actually given in to him. Knowing Karl, he probably would have been so drunk on her presence that he'd have tossed Diane out and spent the whole night with Adele instead. And that realization alone made him even moodier. From there, his imagination just wandered. He pictured what Adele would have been like if she'd broken under him, that proud, sharp gaze finally shaking. He imagined memorizing every moment of it, keeping it tucked away like some twisted treasure. Yeah, someone should have handed him a glass of cold water. Then he remembered his own words, telling Adele she should exist quietly, like some delicate decoration on the throne. Something pretty but harmless. And he honestly couldn't understand why she refused to act that way. In his head, she was a wild beast showing its teeth and claws, and he was convinced the only way to handle her was to rip away everything that made her powerful. Classic Emperor Karl logic. If you can't control something, disarm it. He really thought he could tame her if he just wore her down enough. Meanwhile, the woman he was trying to strategize over was taking a bath. Adele was soaking in a hot tub, trying to wash off the exhaustion of interviewing half the male population of noble families. She looked like she could fall asleep on the spot. But just as she stepped out, Hannah hurried in with news. The Emperor had requested an audience. Our girl wasn't even surprised. Of course Karl would come storming over after hearing about Lionel. It was obvious he wanted answers, and Adele looked like she was ready for him. A few minutes later, Adele stepped out in a stunning green dress to meet the Emperor. She looked calm, composed, and honestly a little too radiant for someone about to deal with Karl. The first thing she said was that his sudden visit wasn't exactly convenient, and she needed time to prepare. A soft way of saying, "Sir, schedule next time." Karl didn't bother pretending he came for anything else. He went straight to the point, asking who she planned to choose as her assistant. Adele asked if she really had to report her decision to him immediately. Karl didn't hesitate, and outright asked if she had chosen Lionel, his voice sharp enough to cut the air. But Adele didn't care. She told him plainly that her choice would be hers alone. Karl then dragged the Baldur family into the argument, basically accusing them of defying the imperial palace and insisting she couldn't pick Lionel. According to him, it would embarrass the royal family. The way he said it made Adele realize he wanted an empress who said nothing and questioned nothing. A royal trophy. Karl didn't even bother to deny it as he smirked. So Adele told him her decision. She had chosen Lionel as her official aide. He was the best candidate. Simple as that. Karl snapped back, raising his voice. But Adele reminded him of something he had said before. He claimed he wouldn't care about her lover as long as she didn't get involved with Diane. So she was just following his own rules. If he preferred to ignore her so-called lover, that was his choice. She explained that she had spent 4 days reviewing every possible candidate. None of them fit except Lionel. Karl's expression darkened. He ordered her to remember her place and stop pushing beyond her limits. But Adele wasn't going to shrink herself for him. He had never treated her as an equal partner, yet he expected obedience and responsibility from her. She wasn't doing that anymore. Karl decided that was enough and walked toward the door. As he left, he threw one last warning over his shoulder. She should have made a smarter decision, or she'd end up regretting it. The comment didn't shake her, But it did remind Adele of something her mother used to drill into her. Act wisely. Think of consequences. And hearing Karl say the same thing made her briefly think that maybe the throne attracts the same kind of people. Ones who think fear is leadership. Outside her chambers, Karl's irritation hadn't cooled. Hannah was waiting, and he turned to her with a question that made her freeze. He asked if she resented the fact that he, the son of a servant, became emperor instead of his older sister. Did she think he stole the crown just because he was a man? Hannah panicked internally but said no. Karl then ordered her to relay a message to the Empress. If Adele wanted to survive in his palace, she needed to learn how to please him. Only then could she protect a position that could be taken away any time. Back inside, Adele was still seated when Hannah entered. And instead of repeating Karl's message immediately, Hannah shared a secret she had carried for years. Before, she served as chamberlain under the former empress and worked as a nanny to the Duchess Grande. But she had also secretly taken care of another child, one whose existence had been hidden carefully. That child was the current emperor. Hannah explained that deep inside, Karl was still that frightened, lonely boy who grew up craving affection but never learned how to accept it. That unresolved hurt twisted him over time until he only knew how to protect himself by shutting everyone out. That made Adele understand a little more about the man she had just stood up to, though it didn't make him any easier to deal with. That same night, Karl went to see Diane. She brightened the moment he walked in, mostly because he'd barely visited her lately. But even at a glance, she could tell something was wrong. Diane tried to figure out what had set him off. She wondered aloud if the Empress and her new aide had finally pushed him too far, calling it bold of Adele to choose an attendant without his approval, especially when everyone believed Karl was always sharp and in control. Karl didn't explain. Instead, he leaned in closer, and when he got near her, he didn't catch that familiar sweet scent that always drifted from Adele and quietly lingered in his thoughts. Trying to steady himself, Karl repeated the same line he had used on Adele, that he wanted Diane to live like a feather on a quill or a flower set prettily in a vase. But unlike Adele, who pushed back, Diane lit up. She touched his face gently, thrilled, and said that was exactly the life she wanted. If she could stay by his side, she'd be happy. To her, Karl was everything. And honestly, this was the response Karl always expected from an empress, but only Diane ever gave it. Hearing her words, Karl relaxed for a moment and brushed his fingers along her lips. Diane, never missing a chance, playfully bit his thumb, expecting him to melt into her arms like he always did. She imagined his violet eyes softening with desire, just like every other time. But instead, Karl pulled away. Diane froze as he turned his back and walked out without a single word. She wasn't used to that. Karl had never rejected her affection before, not once, and she had no idea why. While Karl was storming out of Diane's rooms in confusion, Hannah remained with Adele, quietly peeling back the past piece by piece. She explained that when the former empress discovered her own handmaiden had given birth to the former emperor's child, she was devastated. And things only got worse when her husband openly acknowledged the child and declared him his heir. Karl, taken from his birth mother at such a young age, ended up being raised in the empress's palace, right under the roof of the woman who resented him most. According to Hannah, he figured it out early. At just 6 years old, he learned that the woman who should have cared for him despised him simply because he wasn't hers. Any child would have shattered under that kind of pressure, and Karl was no exception. Then came the final blow. When he was finally allowed to see his real mother after a year, she was already sick and slipping toward death. He got her back, only to lose her again almost immediately. Listening to all this, Adele quietly pieced the story together, and suddenly it became clear why Karl reacted so violently to her. He wasn't just irritated by an empress. He hated everything the title represented. To him, empress belonged to the woman who had crushed him as a child. But even with this understanding, Adele couldn't excuse what he had done, not after everything he had forced her to endure. Knowing someone's pain didn't magically erase the harm they inflicted. Hannah continued, saying his attitude toward Adele wasn't some carefully planned attack. It was more like a reflex, an instinctive reaction shaped by trauma rather than logic. Adele didn't soften, but she coldly stated that she never intended to please him in everything anyway. She remembered vividly how Diane had barged into her life on day one, acting as if she owned everything, telling her how to behave with the emperor, as though Adele lacked a mind of her own. But Adele wasn't raised to bend so easily. She treasured her principles, her honor, her pride. She would rather push back than be shaped into someone else's idea of a quiet, obedient empress. Anyone who watched her for more than a minute could see that clearly. Realizing this, Hannah bowed her head. She apologized, admitting she should have remembered how proud Adele had always been. Telling her how to act was foolish, and she regretted it immediately. Soon after, Karl showed up at Adele's chambers again. Hannah tried to tell him that Adele had only just fallen asleep, but he clearly didn't care. The man acted like the word privacy didn't exist. Barely an hour had passed since he stormed out earlier, yet here he was, barging back. When he stepped inside, he found Adele sitting upright on the bed. She stared at him, demanding to know what exactly he thought he was doing. Karl responded that he came to spend the night with her, then began unbuttoning his shirt. It reminded Adele that the emperor could take anything he wanted, so he had no need to suppress his desires, not even in the empress's presence. Karl smirked, commenting that she looked as though she wanted to kill him. She reminded him that he had warned her moments ago not to do anything she would regret, yet here he was suddenly wanting to spend their first night together. Karl claimed that she had demanded to be his equal, and apparently, in his mind, equality meant fulfilling marital duty at night. He added that he could see her ambition, her desire for influence in the palace, and questioned why she sought support from others instead of relying on him. Like some shady dealmaker, he whispered that if she fulfilled the duties of a wife, he would grant her absolute authority as empress. Adele was beyond done. She wasn't falling for that. She tried to push him away, but her hand was caught mid-movement. Karl pushed harder, saying she was being childish, wanting power without fulfilling the most basic, marital obligation. And yes, intimacy between husband and wife might be normal to everyone else. But that didn't make him any less repulsive in her eyes. Even the thought of him touching her made her stomach twist. Then he reached out, letting his fingers brush against her leg as if he were coaxing a scared animal into a trap. Then he kissed her foot. The look on her face honestly said it all. He then smugly told her that he had already humbled himself by kissing her foot, so now she should submit in return, his fingertips grazing her lips. But Adele shut that down fast. She told him sharply to remove his hands and never touch her again unless she permitted it. Karl didn't take that well. He acted as if her pride was her only real asset, accusing her of snapping and biting like a wild beast that didn't know its place. The empress met his gaze and made it crystal clear she would never bow her head to him, not for power, not for the title, not for anything. She wasn't selling her dignity for a crown. The emperor, however, was confident that Adele would regret her choice, and he stormed out with a smirk. When the room finally quieted, Adele lowered her head. She looked completely drained, the whole confrontation weighing heavily on her. Her mother's warning echoed in her mind. Never do anything you might regret. And right now, she could feel those words settling deep into her bones. The next morning, she woke up hoping, just for a moment, that everything from the previous night had been a nightmare. But reality wasn't that kind. Hannah entered with a tight expression and delivered the news. The emperor had canceled the additional budget for the empress's palace. She could only curse him in her head, wondering just how petty Karl could be. Fortunately, Adele already had a plan, fully confident that the emperor would eventually trip over his own arrogance. The news about the emperor canceling the empress's palace funding spread faster than gossip usually does. And right on cue, Adele fired back with her own official announcement. Lionel was now her personal aide. It was a direct counterattack, loud and clear. People immediately started whispering. People speculated wildly. Some said the Baldur Duchy must be in such a desperate state that even a risky move like this looked like a lifeline. Others just didn't understand why Lionel would willingly walk into this political mess. But none of that fazed him. It was his first day on the job, and he was ready. As for our heroine, she was in her room, waiting calmly like she'd planned this whole morning to be aesthetically pleasing. Autumn always put Adele in a mood for long, meaningful talks, and today was no different. She lounged across the sofa like a woman who ran the place, which she technically did, and somehow the regal tyrant look suited her. Even while relaxing, she didn't miss a thing the maids were doing. That's just the kind of woman she was. After Hannah dismissed the maids, Adele casually asked if any of them had been slipping off to the Ivory Palace lately to report back to Diane. Hannah said none of them had gone for the past week. That alone was suspicious. But what really stood out was that no one had mentioned anything about last night's chaos. Not one whisper. Their quiet conversation ended when Lionel arrived. Adele greeted him with a soft smile, the kind that makes a man forget how to breathe, and said she had truly been excited to see him. Lionel instantly blushed a little, his gaze refusing to leave her, even as she ordered tea with full awareness that this moment would be fueling new palace rumors all day. Once the maids stepped out, the air between them softened. Adele told Lionel she genuinely liked him as an aide and was excited to work with him. Then she admitted a small truth. It didn't come naturally to her to speak informally or act overly familiar, so she asked him to respond with longer answers. She didn't want anyone thinking the Empress was desperately clinging to her handsome aide. Lionel promised to do better and added that he hoped she wouldn't regret choosing him. Adele found it adorable, enough that she chuckled, which only made him blush more. She invited him to try the macarons, saying they were the tastiest thing she'd found in the Empire. Lionel shyly said he would rather not trouble her, but Adele explained that she had always been like this. This was the real her, and the palace was the only place she couldn't act freely. Strangely, the atmosphere between them felt natural, like two people who had been on the same wavelength for years instead of hours. Then Adele brought up the political situation. She asked if the Baldur family was trying to rebalance the power that the Mage Corps had tilted heavily in their own favor. Lionel explained he wanted to change the entire approach to the tower conflict. Right now, the mages held all the information and refused to share anything. It made Adele think of her mother's lesson, how the towers represented power. Her mother once told her that if they used Adele's mage ability correctly, the royal family could practically become untouchable. And the Mage Corps was basically hoarding knowledge and holding people's lives hostage by choosing when, or if, they'd intervene. That realization made Adele's stomach tighten. Luckily, she and the Baldur family had the same goal. Adele admitted she wanted to use her mage identity to secure her place in the Empire's political world, and she asked Lionel to help her do it. But first, they needed to deal with her palace budget issue. Lionel assured her that his family would file an official complaint to the Emperor. That instantly lifted Adele's mood. It was the best news she'd heard in days, but she also confessed she wanted the Emperor to taste the same humiliation he'd pushed on her. Before they got too deep into that, she handed Lionel a document. After reading its content, he immediately understood. Adele intended to repay someone's arrogance in full. The scene then shifted to a merchant arriving at the Empress's palace. He claimed Adele could pick anything she wanted, and that the gift was from Diane. He even had a letter. Diane had already sent payment from the Ivory Palace, as if she was doing Adele a favor. When Adele read the letter later, she realized the amount Diane listed was the price of a single horse. In other words, Diane was telling her to pick something with the same value as the budget increase she had previously approved, all under the excuse of preparing for the upcoming national holiday. Adele was so done. She sarcastically joked about being moved to tears by Diane's kindness. The fact that Diane still dared to provoke her at every chance made Adele's patience evaporate. And so she ordered Hannah to prepare an official document. For a moment, all her emotions broke through. Lionel quietly asked if she truly planned to evict Diane from the Ivory Palace. He warned that kicking her out immediately would only make the court pity her. So the question was, what should Adele do? Before we get Lionel's answer, the scene cuts to Diane, who was happily picking out an expensive necklace. She acted heartbroken that Adele refused her offer, but she was clearly thrilled that the Emperor had canceled the Empress's budget. She pretended she had no choice but to spend that money, all while everyone around her praised her beauty, her luck, and the Emperor's supposed devotion to her. Diane absolutely loved the idea of reminding Adele who held the real influence in the palace. Back with Adele and Lionel, he quietly suggested something. We're not told what it was, yet. But whatever it was, Adele couldn't contain her smirk. Lionel, who always looked so straight-laced, had apparently presented a plan with just enough bite to impress her. And with that, the two settled on a secret scheme. Adele's smile sharpened as she declared that if her enemies wanted a dogfight, then a dogfight was exactly what they would get. Back to the most stressed mistress of the year, Diane was spiraling again. Just a moment earlier, she'd been enjoying life, picking out jewelry, soaking in compliments, and acting like she ran the empire. Everything was perfect, until her brain reminded her of last night. Karl had come to her room, then left, and then came back again. And instead of touching her, he went straight to sleep. For Diane, that was the real red flag. She didn't know what to do with that kind of silence. Her mind immediately went dark, and before she could talk herself out of it, she ordered her most loyal maid to drag in someone from the Empress's palace. Nobody else was to know. Diane wanted answers quietly and fast. And once she had the snitch in front of her, Diane snapped. She grabbed the maid by the shoulders like she was squeezing truth out of a lemon and demanded to know if the Emperor had been at the Empress's residence. Not a hint, but she wanted full details. The maid finally cracked and confirmed it. Yes, Karl went to see Adele. Not once, but twice. The maid explained how the first visit happened right after Adele's bath. Karl left frustrated, and before he ever stepped into Diane's room that night, he went back to Adele again. That was the part that gutted Diane. In her mind, she was the only one who ever saw Karl's intense, hungry stare, the purple eyes, the rough breathing. That side of him was supposed to be hers alone. The idea that he ran to Adele with that same look felt like betrayal on a level she couldn't swallow. Tears started pouring before she could stop them. Trying to pull herself together, she forced herself to the mirror. She reminded herself, over and over, that she had to stay beautiful, that her appearance was her strongest weapon. But the reflection staring back wasn't the one she remembered. There were faint lines around her eyes. Her skin didn't glow the way Karl liked, and even she could see she looked tired. And now she regretted calling in merchants instead of her usual skincare expert. Then she panicked even more, checking her own body for weight changes or signs of pregnancy. Nothing. And that nothing tore her apart. She knew that neither she nor Karl was infertile, yet each month without a child felt like the universe was mocking her. It was like her entire future collapsed in one moment. Her hopes, her leverage, her illusions of security. Meanwhile, Adele was already informed that one of her maids had been summoned to the Ivory Palace. None of it surprised her. This was the kind of petty move she expected from that side. Hannah cautiously asked if they should replace the maid, but Adele refused. Changing one servant didn't guarantee loyalty. At least with the current staff, she knew where each person stood. She stamped her seal on a freshly prepared document and let out a long, tired sigh. This was officially her first real command as Empress, and even she couldn't believe this was how her reign was beginning. Over in the council hall, the mood was already tense. Reports came in that Count Calvin's entire territory had evacuated to neighboring Count Barthold's lands. Barthold and Viscount Orleans were apparently holding the line together, trying to keep monsters from slipping into either region. They also confirmed the worst part. A level 3 tower had appeared, and level 3 flying gargoyles were sighted. Anyone in the Empire knew that was no joke. Lennox, of course, couldn't help himself. He made a snide comment, asking if witnesses maybe got confused and mistook Gagnères for gargoyles, because according to him, true gargoyles were nearly unbeatable, and regular knights wouldn't survive 10 seconds without mages. One of the knights in the room immediately bristled. He fired back that if Lennox was so doubtful, maybe he should have gone there himself instead of mocking the people actually risking their lives. Lennox was itching to argue, but the Duke shut him down with a sharp reminder of where he was. Lennox apologized instantly, the kind of instant apology that says, "I want to fight you, but I also want to keep my job." Karl's eyes slid over to Lionel. As defense minister, Lionel's opinion mattered. Though judging by Karl's expression, he wished it didn't. The Emperor already disliked Lionel, but today, something about the man irritated him even more. Before answering the question, Lionel shot one back at the Mage Corps. He reminded everyone of the day a tower descended near the palace. The knights stood ready. They waited for the Mage Corps to arrive. The tower got closer and closer. And instead of mages, someone unexpected showed up. The Empress. She rode the updraft straight into danger and destroyed the tower by herself before it even touched the ground. Lionel noted how impressive she had been, and Lennox, who couldn't leave it alone, muttered about how Lionel seemed oddly familiar with the details, hinting that maybe Adele was fond of him too. It was petty but predictable. Lionel didn't even blink at the jab. He continued, explaining that it was Adele who warned Count Calvin to evacuate when she identified the flying monsters as proof of a level 3 tower. She even sent him emergency funds, an actual gold bar, so he could move people safely. Then he went right back to his real point. Where was the Mage Corps during all of this? Did they plan to help, or were they simply incapable? Both Lennox and the Duke looked frustrated, but neither dared to answer. Lionel wrapped it up cleanly. That was his response as defense minister, and they needed to send mages immediately because people were in danger. Karl stared at Lionel with a cold silence that lasted a little too long. Anyone could see he wasn't pleased. Theseus jumped in, asking for the Emperor's stance. And because Theseus rarely missed a chance to stir the pot, he also pointed out that Adele should be given the authority naturally belonging to her position. He even straight up asked why the budget increase for the Empress's palace had been cancelled. Karl finally reacted, laughing in this bitter, sharp way. He accused the brothers of talking nonstop about Adele now that Lionel was her lover. He warned Lionel to choose sides wisely. Even commoner wives, he said, helped their husbands. Maybe Lionel should stop flaunting his love life. Lionel stayed calm, but Theseus stepped in to defend him, pointing out how bold the Emperor's accusation was. But before the argument got any louder, the Emperor's aide rushed in. He announced that Adele had issued an order. Karl looked at the document, and even he couldn't believe what he was holding. But the seal was real, and there was no denying it. Adele had formally ordered Diane to leave the Ivory Palace. Lennox practically exploded in disbelief. He argued that Karl had allowed Diane to live there. But the aide clarified the law. The Empress held the authority to decide who stayed in the palace. Adele did acknowledge Diane's service and agreed to grant her special permission to remain, but only as a guest. And guests paid for their own expenses. In other words, Diane could stay, but she had to pay rent. Rent that cost more than her entire family could realistically afford. Karl didn't say a single word. He stood up immediately, clearly preparing to storm out and deal with Adele himself. Around the room, nobles whispered to each other. Many agreed with Adele. Diane wasn't royalty, yet she walked around like she was the owner of the entire palace. Getting charged rent suddenly seemed fair. Lennox heard the whispers and looked like he was about to level the whole room if he didn't leave, so he walked out before something exploded, literally or socially. Theseus leaned in and quietly asked Lionel if this whole Diane situation had been his idea. Lionel smirked and confirmed it. His big brother really did know him well. Theseus felt a headache forming, but he couldn't scold him. Before he could say anything else, Lionel's tone shifted. He told Theseus he had something important to share. When Karl stormed toward the Empress Palace looking like a walking thundercloud, Adele appeared right in front of him before he could even look for her. She was wearing a long black cloak, the kind of outfit that basically screams, "I'm leaving, don't follow me." Naturally, Karl asked where she was going dressed like that, but Adele didn't bother entertaining him. She just stepped past the question and asked why he had shown up at her palace in the first place. Karl didn't waste time either. He demanded she withdraw her order about Diane. Adele smiled at him like she'd been waiting for that line all day. Instead of answering, she threw him a deal. If he withdrew the command canceling her palace budget increase, then she would also take back her order. She clarified that she didn't evict Diane. Adele was basically saying, "Your little favorite can stay, but she's paying rent," in his face. Karl didn't even try to hide his irritation. He said he wasn't here to bargain and demanded she retract her order immediately, his voice rising as if volume would magically make her obedient. Adele didn't budge. She told him he needed to address something first, specifically the merchant incident in her palace earlier. To her, it was a direct insult. Some merchant from the Ivory Palace had approached her with an item of her choice, worth the same price as a single horse. It was ridiculous, and of course she rejected it. She made it clear, if anyone drew their sword against her, she would draw her own. It was the Egmont Empire's proverb, and ironically, she was the only one following it right now. When Adele tried to walk past him, Karl grabbed her shoulder, demanding to know where she was going. Adele didn't hesitate, and simply said she was traveling incognito, which was perfectly allowed under imperial law. In fact, she quoted the exact clause that gave the Empress the right to leave without the Emperor's approval, and the right to keep her destination secret. She didn't have many advantages in this empire, but at least the law was still on her side. For now, that was one of her weapons. Calmly, she told him she wanted to see how the common people lived. One trip wouldn't teach her everything, but it was better than knowing nothing at all. Then she walked away without even glancing back. Karl stood there simmering, and for a brief, dangerously unhinged moment, he wished he could drag her back, hold her down, breathe her in, and trap her before she slipped even further from his grasp. But instead, he just cursed under his breath, furious at her, at himself, and especially at the thought of her traveling without him having a single say in it. Outside the palace gates, the Baldur brothers had everything ready. The carriage was neatly waiting, and Adele was already sitting inside. Once the brothers climbed in, she pulled down her hood and thanked them politely for letting her use their carriage. As soon as the wheels started rolling, Adele mentioned that Lionel had already agreed to let her stay at the Baldur estate for 3 to 4 days. She wanted to check if the Duke himself was fine with it, and Theseus immediately said yes. During the ride, Adele turned toward the window, watching the streets pass by. She couldn't help asking if this was the Empire's usual standard of living. Everyone outside seemed decently dressed, and while she couldn't see inside their homes, the exteriors were clean and properly maintained. To her, they looked like middle-class families, not the general population. Theseus asked what she thought of the people in there, and Adele shared her observations honestly. Back in her homeland, these people would actually be considered well off. Theseus agreed that they were indeed seeing the middle class here. Then he told her the truth. There was a large slum about 10 minutes north, built along a small river. Those slums were where refugees, whose homes were destroyed by towers, ended up living in there. And with more towers falling across the empire, these slums were growing fast. Adele wasn't surprised, because it matched exactly what she had suspected. Their conversation drifted naturally to Count Calvin. Theseus asked why Adele had bothered helping the man. Adele answered simply, "She did what any human should do for another." Lionel then curiously asked if she had been used to doing charity work back in her homeland. Adele explained that she wasn't just used to it. She founded and led Kotrov's anti-tower headquarters. Only 6 months ago, she was dedicating everything she had to protecting her people. She wanted the towers gone, all of them, and she refused to let a single monster reach the ground. She remembered the gratitude from the villagers, especially a young girl who placed a flower crown on her head to thank her for saving them. Adele still kept that memory close. It felt as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. Save every last person and leave no one behind. Do your duty toward your fellow human beings. That was the principle she built the anti-tower headquarters on. The Baldur brothers listened quietly, clearly impressed. Lionel in particular looked like his respect for Adele doubled on the spot. When they finally reached the Baldur estate, Adele stared at it with open admiration. She called it a beautiful home, and Lionel couldn't help smiling as he thanked her. Inside, Theseus noticed something that stunned him. Adele casually calling Lionel by his first name. To him, that was far too casual, especially for someone of her status. Adele then asked if the place had many books. Lionel explained that their family came from a long line of book collectors, and he immediately offered to escort her to the library himself. Meanwhile, Theseus was sweating bullets. Watching the Empress and his younger brother speak like they were close was sending alarm bells through his head. He couldn't decide if Lionel was genuinely aiming to become the Empress's lover, or if he was simply being friendly. But honestly, the line was getting thinner by the second. Adele suddenly realized she had asked Lionel instead of Theseus for permission to enter the library. She turned to the Duke and asked whether he would allow her to use it. Theseus, still flustered from everything, looked like his brain needed a reboot. Adele then realized he wasn't used to her speaking casually with Lionel, but she didn't exactly have a choice. They had to convince the world they were lovers after all. Feeling a little awkward, she shyly asked if Theseus would allow her to speak informally to him as well. The moment she finished the sentence, she instantly shut her mouth, as if realizing she hadn't phrased it the way she wanted. Lionel tried his best not to burst into laughter, though his shoulders were shaking, completely giving him away. Thankfully, Theseus saved her from drowning in embarrassment. He calmly told her she could freely use the library on the second floor of the annex during her stay. Lionel then guided Adele upstairs, and even though she tried to act unbothered, Her ears were still bright red, a detail that genuinely made Lionel smile. He'd never seen Adele flustered like that, and it was strangely endearing. While Adele was settling comfortably at the Baldur estate, things were falling apart on Diane's side. Hannah arrived at the Ivory Palace carrying the new order and read it out loud. The message said she had to choose: either stay in the palace as a guest or return to her family estate as soon as possible. To Diane, it was the worst thing she could have heard. She'd lived in this palace for years, practically treated it as her own home, and no one had ever dared push her out before. Hannah calmly set the document on the table and said the order came directly from the Empress. Diane felt bitterness settle straight into her bones. Of course, Adele would try to force her out. Hannah added that the Empress had valid reasons, and even if the Emperor once allowed Diane to stay, that didn't matter anymore. Diane's frustration exploded. She said she wasn't leaving until she heard a direct command from Karl himself. But Hannah didn't care, and coldly explained that if Diane insisted on staying in the Ivory Palace, she'd now have to pay monthly rent to the Imperial Palace's finance department. Every expense would be calculated and sent to her. From today onward, everything related to palace living fell under the Empress's authority. The law clearly backed Adele's power, and she didn't need the Emperor's approval. And soon, even the maids would be reassigned, and that authority also belonged to Adele. Diane couldn't take it. She stopped Hannah and demanded she deliver a message to the Empress. If Adele dared treat her like this, one day she would regret it. Diane was confident Karl would never allow her removal, and that he would never abandon her after all these years. But then Hannah stepped closer and touched Diane's cheek, almost pitying her. She whispered that ever since she last saw Diane, small wrinkles had started forming around her eyes and lips. More would follow soon. Leaning in even closer, Hannah said she knew exactly what Diane had been using as her weapon to stay by the Emperor's side. And then she added that Diane reminded her of Karl's birth mother. That was the moment Diane snapped. She yelled at Hannah to shut her mouth and stop speaking with that snake-like tongue of hers. But Hannah wasn't done. She asked if Diane remembered how old Karl's mother had been when she died. It was 29. Beatrice was known for her perfect youthful face, without a hint of aging. To the former emperor, she would always remain a young, flawless woman frozen in time. Diane, however, didn't have that luxury. Time was moving for her, and the signs were starting to show. Instead of challenging Adele or sending merchants around her, Hannah told Diane she should pay attention to herself, especially her skin, because she was clearly aging. On top of that, Hannah reminded her there were plenty of blonde, blue-eyed girls across the empire. Younger, fresher, and ambitious, all waiting for a chance to get close to the Emperor, the same way Diane once had. With that, Hannah left her there, and the weight of her words filled the entire room. Diane was shaking with anger and humiliation. She had always believed the luxury she lived in was something she'd earned with her own effort. She was the one who cared the most for the Imperial Palace. She was the one managing it at Karl's side. In her mind, everything there should have belonged to her. Under her breath, she cursed Adele. The Empress had nothing except a title, but Diane had been the one truly watching over Karl. She had even once begged him to make her his only wife, but he'd refused without hesitation. Even now, she couldn't understand why he chose to make her suffer like this. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered the question she never dared ask out loud. Why couldn't she be the Empress? It was just a title. Why couldn't Karl have given it to her? But before she spiraled too far, she suddenly jumped up and ran to the mirror. She told herself to stop crying because tears meant more wrinkles. She wiped her face quickly and forced a smile, trying to relax her expression the way she'd trained herself to for years. Then she called her loyal maid and ordered her to summon a skincare expert immediately. Because if Diane was going to fight for her place, she wasn't going to let aging be the thing that defeated her. Meanwhile, Adele was tucked away in the library again, completely absorbed in whatever book had stolen her attention this time. She didn't even notice the Baldur brothers until they stopped right in front of her. They politely invited her to dine with them, and the moment her stomach growled in agreement, Adele closed the book without hesitation. Hunger won instantly. Honestly, who wouldn't give in? After a tasty meal, the three of them settled with warm tea. The vibe was calm, but Lionel eventually shifted things back to business. He brought up the issue of the towers, reminding Adele that last time she'd said it was a 4th-level tower, except its power looked way closer to a 5th. A small detail, but a big difference in mage standards. Adele explained calmly that level 4 towers were manageable, but the advanced variations were too strong even for her. When Lionel asked if she did actually destroy towers in her homeland before they ever hit the ground, Adele nodded and said she'd discovered the technique by chance about 5 years earlier. Ever since then, her main rule had been to take them out mid-air. But she quickly noted that the real issue wasn't the strike, it was getting up there. Not many mages could ride the updraft the way she could. That meant she destroyed about half the towers before they landed, and the other half only after they'd already hit the ground. Lionel pointed out how huge the damage difference must be between the two methods. Adele agreed, but also reminded him of what they had seen the other day. As long as the striker like her didn't fall, and the tower was destroyed in the air, no real damage occurred. Theseus quietly jumped in, asking how she felt about leaving towers that had already touched the ground as they were, and if it was still possible to deal with them at that point. Adele gave a firm no. Once a tower had landed, handling it again was out of the question, unless it was already half destroyed. That was when Lionel pulled out a map of the Ekmont Empire. He flattened it out, placed a small stone on one marked spot, and Adele's eyes instantly caught the countless red dots covering the map. She didn't even need an explanation. She knew exactly what they were. Lionel confirmed her suspicion. Every single dot represented a tower currently managed by the Empire's mages. Adele stared at the map in disbelief, wondering how on earth they could ignore this many towers while pretending everything was under control. To her, it looked less like an empire and more like a disaster zone pretending to be a functioning nation. She didn't hold back, and bluntly said that if all those red stones truly represented towers, then the entire empire was basically a living hell right now. Lionel sighed, finally admitting that the situation was far worse than the mages had ever revealed. Then he looked at Adele and asked for her help, explaining that the people of the empire desperately needed her now. A little later, Diane was still standing in front of the mirror, carefully studying her reflection. She was so focused that when her maid suddenly announced the Emperor's arrival, Diane's mood instantly flipped. Then, in record time, she switched expressions, her bright face fading into something pale and fragile. By the time Karl walked in, she already looked like she might collapse from the effort of simply standing. Karl immediately noticed the change. She looked thinner than before, her lips drained of color, her neck so delicate it looked like it could snap if she moved too fast. For a moment, something about that image hit him hard. He felt suffocating, like being pulled into deep water with no way up. Diane saw his expression and misunderstood it instantly. It was obvious. He must be upset because the Empress was trying to push her out. And seeing her like this, of course he felt sorry, and only came to comfort her. So without thinking twice, she threw herself into his arms. However, Karl didn't hug her back. Diane quickly tried to recover, insisting she was fine, telling him not to worry. But even she could tell it wasn't working. The mood had already shifted. Then Karl asked the question that froze her on the spot. Was she the one who sent the merchants to the Empress? Diane went still, her mind scrambling for an answer. Before she could even form one, Karl repeated the question, this time sharper, and added that the amount she offered was equal to the price of a single horse. That's when it hit her. He came to question her. Still, Diane tried to fix it. She quickly explained that she only felt sorry for the Empress. With the extra budget gone, Adele wouldn't even be able to buy basic things. So she acted out of kindness, or at least, that's what she claimed. She admitted it may have been foolish, but insisted she meant no harm. She even tried to clear the price issue, saying she hadn't set it that low and had given the merchant the original amount. After all, the money came from him in the first place. Then she apologized, blaming everything on her impulsiveness. Karl just looked like he regretted coming. The whole situation gave him a headache. He told her plainly there was no reason to provoke Adele. Then he reminded her of something simple. She used to be satisfied with just his love. Diane quickly agreed almost too fast. Karl told her not to forget that. As long as she remembered it, he could still protect her. And then, he told her to leave the Ivory Palace. Diane felt her chest tighten, as if the ground beneath her had just disappeared. Karl tried to soften it slightly, saying he would arrange another residence where Adele wouldn't have control over her, and if she didn't like that option, she could return to her family. But to Diane, none of that mattered. She grabbed onto him, desperate, her composure finally breaking. She begged him not to send her away, not to abandon her like this. Karl pulled his hand away, warning her not to speak to him so intimately anymore. And just before leaving, he said something that cut even deeper. She was starting to sound more and more like his mother. Then he walked out, leaving her behind without another glance. Deep down, Diane knew he was still being kind in his own way. He wasn't throwing her out completely, and was still offering her something. But it wasn't the same anymore, and that was what hurt the most. Back at the Balder estate, the night finally settled down. The Duke told Adele that the butler would guide her to her room, and that she could ask for anything she needed. Adele appreciated that kind of energy, very different from the palace where every word felt like a trap. They exchanged goodnights, and before leaving, Adele gave Lionel a friendly farewell. Everyone went their separate ways. Except sleep clearly wasn't invited. Adele lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts running nonstop. Between palace politics, Diane's drama, Karl's nonsense, and the whole tower situation, her brain refused to clock out. Lionel wasn't doing any better. Also wide awake, he decided to read, probably hoping a book would knock him out. But just as he picked one up, something caught his attention. Adele's room still had the lights on. Now that immediately raised questions. Just then, a small pebble hit his window. He looked outside, and sure enough, it was the Empress herself. Turns out, she just wanted to know where she could get alcohol. Minutes later, they met up, and Adele casually asked why he was still awake too. Lionel, who absolutely could not say "because I keep thinking about you," immediately dodged the question and asked why she needed alcohol instead. Adele saw right through that in seconds. Still, she explained she couldn't sleep, while Lionel tried to offer some half-hearted advice about not relying on alcohol. She ignored it like it didn't exist, and told him to just bring the whiskey. Lionel hesitated, not because he didn't have it, but because he knew it was strong. But Adele stood firm, like this was part of her nightly routine. She even told him to stop nagging. Now imagine being called naggy by the Empress. That was new. Anyway, Lionel gave in. She invited him to drink with her too, but he declined, probably knowing this could spiral fast. So he just stood there as Adele took the glass and almost finished it in one go like it was water. Lionel looked like he had just witnessed something illegal. Adele, on the other hand, casually said it was refreshing. Clearly, this woman was built different. After that, she loosened up a bit. She admitted things had been tense since she arrived. People were hostile for reasons she didn't fully understand, and the tower problem wasn't exactly small either. Still, she added that things felt a little easier now, thanks to Lionel. She poured another glass and drank it just as quickly, admitting her thoughts wouldn't stop racing. Lionel, watching all this, commented that she handled things well, and that he respected her for it. Which, honestly, was the most sincere thing he could say without overstepping. She thanked him again after another drink, saying she felt a bit better. Then her attention shifted to a nearby painting, a family portrait. Lionel was in it, much younger. The kid in the painting looked lively. Lionel admitted that, according to his father, he used to be a troublemaker. Nothing serious, just constant, harmless chaos that somehow always managed to annoy people. Adele laughed, imagining it, saying she would have liked to meet that version of him. She even called him adorable without hesitation. Lionel, trying to keep his composure, said he was glad he met her now instead. After all, if he were still that kid, he wouldn't even qualify to stand beside her, let alone be her aide. That just made her laugh more. She told him that even if he wasn't her advisor, he would still be around anyway, probably making her laugh like this. Lionel noticed her cheeks slightly flushed, and that relaxed smile she never showed in the palace. For a moment, the Empress he knew, the cold, distant one, was nowhere to be seen. Right now, she just looked like a normal, beautiful woman enjoying a quiet moment. Adele noticed his stare and gave him a look, clearly wondering what was going on in his head. Lionel snapped out of it immediately and looked away, refusing to let his growing feelings show. Adele, noticing the faint blush, just assumed it was the alcohol, but she found it kind of cute. Not that she said it out loud. Instead, she gave him an opening. She told him he could ask her anything, something he normally wouldn't dare ask the Empress. After a brief pause, he actually took the chance. He asked why she agreed to marry into a distant empire, especially when she had such an important role back home dealing with the towers. Adele spoke about her family, how things used to be warm and stable. Then everything collapsed when her father suddenly died. The empire fell into chaos, and her mother pushed her to marry. Even her work, everything she built, wasn't enough to change that decision. But she also admitted she didn't refuse either. Part of it was her choice. Lionel noticed the shift in her expression. Something deeper was there, something she wasn't saying out loud. So he didn't push and just let it be. Adele also seemed to realize that was enough for one night. The mood had already drifted far from light conversation, so she suggested they call it a night. At the same time, Karl did what he always did when things got messy. He drank alone. As the alcohol settled in, his mind drifted back to the past. He remembered being a child, sitting in the middle of his coronation, surrounded by people praising him, as if he had already conquered the world. Back then, his uncle August told him he was now the most respected man in the empire, promising him everything: power, control, anything he could ever want. Funny enough, those words were meant to be reassuring, and Karl did have everything that was promised to him. So why did everything still feel so wrong? His thoughts kept circling back to Adele, where she was, what she was doing. He tried to brush it off, telling himself she probably just stormed off because of the budget issue. That sounded reasonable enough. Then came the report. No maids had followed her. Even Hannah didn't know where she went. The Emperor, who was used to knowing everything, suddenly realized he had no idea where his own wife was. That didn't just annoy him, it infuriated him. Once he thought about it carefully, the answer came almost immediately. Adele was a foreigner. In this entire empire, there was only one place she could go: the Baldur family. Frustrated, he smashed the glass in his hand onto the table. It shattered instantly. The next morning, Lionel didn't get much sleep. His mind kept replaying one specific moment from the night before. Adele's genuine laughter. It was still ringing in his ears. Eventually, he gave up on trying to rest and headed down to the drawing room with his brother. There she was, already waiting as if nothing had happened. Adele greeted him casually, and even told him she slept well thanks to him. Then she asked how he slept. Lionel, keeping himself composed, simply replied that he slept fine too. As the two walked ahead, the Duke quietly watched them from behind. Something had changed. He couldn't quite place it, but the air between them felt different, subtle, yet noticeable, like something had shifted overnight. A little later, the Duke asked Adele about her plans for the day. She admitted she already had something in mind, but she needed help, specifically a few trustworthy knights who knew the area well. That immediately caught Lionel's attention. He asked what she needed them for. She didn't hesitate. She wanted to visit the slums, personally from the inside. At that, Lionel declared that he would escort her himself. The way he said it made one thing clear: this wasn't optional. Not long after they set out, Adele, being polite as always, asked if she was taking up his time. Lionel assured her he had the whole day free. No complaints. Soon they reached a river, where things immediately got worse. They had to put on masks, not just for disguise, but for survival. The smell alone was enough to make anyone regret coming. Lionel explained that beyond that river, the Niavara, was where the slums began. Ironically, the name meant something clean and pure. Now it was the complete opposite. Adele quickly understood the situation. The lack of proper facilities, the condition of the place. It was obvious things were bad, but hearing the details made it worse. People handled waste indoors, then threw it outside. That explained the smell. And the burning scent in the air? Even worse, it came from bodies. There wasn't enough space for the living, so the dead were burned nearby. At that point, Adele removed her mask. There was no point hiding her identity here. No one cared. People were too busy trying to survive. As they moved deeper, the scene only grew heavier. People approached them, begging for coins, for food, for anything. It didn't take long for Adele to realize this wasn't just poverty, it was complete neglect. And it wasn't limited to one place. There were multiple slums like this across the empire. By the time they passed through, Lionel glanced at her, curious. He asked if she had seen enough, and more importantly, what she planned to do, especially if the Emperor stood against her. Adele didn't even understand why he would. Lionel explained that Karl already knew about these places. He always had. So the real question was, what if he chose to ignore it, or worse, oppose her? Adele's expression turned cold. She said plainly that anyone who could see this and do nothing shouldn't even call themselves human. She couldn't understand how things were allowed to get this bad. The nobles were doing nothing while the situation kept worsening. Towers were appearing, danger was growing, and yet those in power remained comfortable. What angered her most was their priorities. There were guards blocking roads, but no hospitals, no schools, no proper systems to help people survive. It made no sense. Then she asked the question, what had the Minister of Defense been doing all this time? Lionel didn't answer. He knew he was part of that system. Adele quickly realized she had snapped and apologized, but the weight of her words remained. But deep down, Lionel had wanted someone to be angry about all of this. Her words felt sincere, and it made her feel closer to him. His heart pounded as he declared that no matter what she decided to do, he would support her. Back at the Emperor's palace, reality hit Diane fast. She was no longer in the Ivory Palace. She returned to the VIP guest room she used to stay in, the one she had long outgrown. Servants stood there, clearly overwhelmed, asking where all her belongings should go. There were too many things and not nearly enough space to keep them. Diane ordered everything to be sent back to her family's estate. As evening came, she waited, but Karl never showed up. At first, she tried to stay calm, telling herself he was just busy. But as time passed, that excuse started to sound weaker and weaker. Eventually, she couldn't take it anymore. If he wasn't coming to her, then she would go to him. On the way, a servant stepped in to stop her, carefully reminding her that she was now just a guest in the palace. That word alone probably hit harder than intended. But Diane wasn't in the mood to hear it. She cut him off and made it clear she was going to see Karl. No one was stopping her. When she finally entered his room, the atmosphere immediately felt off. Karl was there, drinking alone, not even glancing in her direction. Only when she spoke did he slowly turn toward her. Diane quickly noticed it, the look on his face. He was bothered. And she didn't need long to figure out why. Of course, it was Adele. Trying to stay composed, Diane brought it up herself, saying the Empress was probably at the Baldur Duchy. There was nowhere else she could go anyway. She went further, implying that Adele was likely with Lionel. Karl immediately told her to stop, but Diane didn't back down. She insisted that she was the one who had always stayed by his side, that no matter what happened, she would always be there for him. Instead of softening, Karl's expression only worsened. Even his voice carried a cold edge that warned others to step back. Anyone else would have stopped right there. Diane didn't. She kept going, holding on to the one thing she believed in, that she was the only one who truly understood him. Deep down, though, her thoughts were a mess. She didn't want him thinking about Adele. Didn't want him looking at anyone else. She was practically begging for him to be hers completely. The more she tried to hold on to him, the more it felt like he was slipping away. That same night, Lionel noticed that Adele still hadn't returned, which was already unusual. After asking around, he finally heard she was in the reading room. He decided to check for himself. He knocked, announced his presence, and stepped inside, only to find an empty chair. He ran through a few possibilities. Maybe she was with his brother? But then he remembered something specific. At this hour, she tended to drink. Without wasting time, he headed straight to the place he had in mind. And sure enough, there she was, already sitting with a glass in hand. Adele didn't even try to hide it. She casually admitted he had caught her red-handed and even invited him to join her, as if this were a normal late-night routine. Lionel assumed she couldn't sleep again. And Adele, she simply said she was thirsty. Still, he couldn't ignore how much she'd been drinking lately. He warned her she might overdo it. maybe even hurt herself at this rate. Adele brushed it off like it was nothing. She said one glass wouldn't even make a dent, and if she was going to drink, she might as well do it properly. She even made it clear she didn't want him hovering over her like some strict guardian. Tonight she wanted to get drunk. The mood in the room slowly settled into something quiet, almost comfortable. Before Lionel realized it, he was staring at her again, lost in his own thoughts. But Adele caught it immediately. She asked why he kept making that same expression. She had noticed it before, the kind where he looked like he had a lot on his mind, and none of it was light. Lionel didn't dodge this time. He admitted that being her aide wasn't as honorable as people made it seem. That role came with consequences. Adele told him she would protect his reputation. When the time came, she would even make an official statement to clear his name. People would know there was nothing personal between them, just business. It might not fix everything, but at least it wouldn't leave Lionel's reputation completely ruined. Then she teased him to stop staring like that, or he'd get wrinkles on his handsome face. That was when she noticed Lionel pouring himself a drink. She was surprised, since he always insisted on watering it down. But without a word, he downed the entire glass as if it were nothing. Afterward, he explained that if he had truly cared about his honor, he wouldn't have become her advisor in the first place. He knew exactly what that role entailed. After all, he had been born in the Empire. Hearing that, something clicked in Adele's mind. Did he actually want to be her lover? Lionel quickly corrected himself, saying she shouldn't worry so much about his reputation. Adele, trying to keep things grounded, suggested they maintain proper boundaries. If they acted too casually, people might misunderstand their relationship even more than they already did. By then, she was already feeling the effects of the alcohol. Her words began to slur slightly, and she asked for a glass of water. As she stood and walked toward the window, she suddenly stumbled and nearly fell, but Lionel caught her just in time. Concerned, he asked if she was all right. For a moment, she found herself caught in his intense gaze, as if he were looking straight through her. She almost got lost in it, but quickly stepped back, saying they should stop drinking for the night. She tried to steady herself. Lionel wasn't trying to cross any lines. He had already made that clear. Right now, he was simply being a reliable support, and she didn't want to betray that trust. Lionel gently took her hand and swore that he too would never betray Adele. Meanwhile, Diane was still holding on and pleading, but none of it was getting through. Karl wasn't even really listening anymore. His mind was stuck on only one thing, more specifically, Adele being with Lionel. It just kept looping in his head, getting more irritating every second. Suddenly, Karl walked away, leaving Diane on the floor like everything she said meant nothing. Whatever hope Diane had left cracked, but there was nothing she could do about it. Fast forward a bit, and Adele finally returns to her palace. The servants welcome her right away, already offering to prepare a warm bath. The atmosphere has changed, subtle, but noticeable. It doesn't take long for Adele to guess. Diane is gone from the Ivory Palace. Right on cue, Hannah appears and confirms it. Diane has been moved to a guest room, and her status has been downgraded. When Adele asks if anything else has happened, Hannah says nothing major, except for one thing. One of the Emperor's servants has been persistently asking about her whereabouts. And right as that is mentioned, the Emperor himself shows up. Adele isn't exactly thrilled to see him, but she already has a guess why he came. She assumes he'll bring up the issue with Diane again, but instead, he asks where she has been. Adele replies that she has already answered that question before. That should have been enough. But Karl pushes. He asks again, this time more directly. Has she been with Lionel? Adele's answer turns cold. Even if she had been, it isn't his business. That response sets him off. He coldly states that she needs to give him an heir, which is why he cannot ignore the possibility of her getting pregnant by another man. He makes it clear he would never accept another man's child. To Adele, his words are complete nonsense. He calls his own affairs romance, yet treats hers as unacceptable. She fires back, telling him he has no right to control her, and if he wants to punish her, he should stop with these petty moves and just say it directly. She mockingly suggests that he try to seduce her. Who knows? Maybe if he succeeds, she might loosen up a bit. She even dares him to try putting a collar on her so subtly she wouldn't notice. Karl realizes she's provoking him and doesn't truly mean it, so he stops arguing. Instead, he simply tells her to rest and says he will visit her later. Adele is left stunned. She can't understand his behavior at all. Not long after, another situation popped up. A merchant arrived at the palace again. This time, the maids are quick to say they didn't call for anyone, but the merchant explains he was sent by the emperor. That immediately raises questions. Hannah reports it to Adele, who listens quietly before saying she doesn't need anything, and to send the man away. She notes that the emperor seemed furious the last time, but Hannah points out that he left calmly, which somehow makes it even more suspicious. Adele can't figure him out. Nothing has happened between them to explain this shift. It hasn't even been a week since he cut her budget. And now this? To her, it just feels like another one of his games. Hannah, thinking ahead, suggests something practical. If the emperor is sending money anyway, why not use it to buy gold? That catches Adele's interest, so she agrees. Soon enough, a chest is brought in, filled with gold bars. It's worth even more than the budget she originally lost. Of course, there's a note from Karl. It says that while he could have given her a budget, he chose to send her a gift instead. The scene shifted to Lionel's internal conflict. Even after everything went according to plan, Lionel couldn't shake the uneasy feeling lingering in his chest. He kept wondering if the Empress had arrived safely. It left him restless, confused. And honestly, even he didn't know what he wanted anymore. Before he realized it, his feet had already taken him somewhere familiar. The room where they used to drink together. Of course, his mind didn't stay quiet either. That night replayed itself clearly, the moment Adele casually asked if he wanted to be her lover. For a split second, it felt so real. Lionel quickly snapped back to reality, brushing it off. But that only made another thought hit him harder. Why had he personally applied when Adele announced she needed an assistant? He could have sent someone else. Anyone else. But no, he hadn't even thought twice. The moment he heard it, he stepped forward himself. At first, he tried to make excuses, told himself it was necessary, that it made sense strategically. But in the end, even he couldn't keep lying. The truth was simple. He had been drawn to her from the very beginning. That was exactly why he had to stop. If he let those feelings grow, it wouldn't just affect him. It could damage her reputation. And that was something he could never allow. So Lionel made a decision. No matter what he felt, he would bury it deep inside. The next day, Adele was greeted by an unexpected sight. Her residence was suddenly crowded with servants and guards, all sent by the Emperor. At first glance, it might look like generosity, but Adele saw right through it. If anything, this only confirmed her suspicion. There was no plan to restore her budget anytime soon. Instead, he chose the easier route, sending manpower instead of actual support. Hannah asked what should be done with them. Sending them all back outright might create unnecessary tension. So instead, Adele came up with a more subtle approach. The servants could stay, but they weren't to be given any real tasks unless needed. As for the guards, there were far too many. So she calmly ordered that at least half be sent back. Just as things settled, Hannah added another update. August had requested an audience with the Empress. Soon, tea was served, and August began praising her abilities, calling her an exceptional mage, and openly admitting how impressed he had been. He even suggested she visit the mage corps when she had time. Now that caught her attention. In Egmont, mages received their rank the moment they officially took office. Adele already knew what she wanted. Nothing less than the commander's position. She was basically telling that old man to give up his own position in the mage corps. Of course, the sly man quickly dodged it and suddenly changed the topic instead. He asked why she had chosen the Baldur family as her ally. The question sounded simple, but the meaning behind it wasn't. Then he reminded her that he was part of the Emperor's family. Meaning, if she had chosen him instead, things might have been much easier. He even claimed to understand her current struggles and offered, though a bit too late, to deal with Diane himself. After all, according to him, people who didn't know their place were always the hardest to get rid of. How convenient. But Adele didn't bite. She asked her own question. Why had he been neglecting the towers? She demanded to know why he had abandoned them, and what purpose they truly served. she made one thing very clear. She had no intention of building her reputation through the Emperor's affection. And as for Diane, he could leave her alone. What truly mattered to her was the source of power within the Empire. That question made even August pause. But soon enough, he gave her an answer. He offered her the chance to become the master of a tower. According to him, magic was a divine gift. And while owning a tower didn't grant political power, it offered something far greater. Enough to elevate her existence to something almost like a goddess. Now that was an offer that couldn't be taken lightly. With that, the Duke took his leave, promising to visit her again. As soon as he stepped out, Adele's condition shifted drastically. Her face contorted in pure disgust, as if something deep inside her had violently rejected whatever had just occurred. Hannah rushed to her side, panic etched across her features, calling for a doctor immediately. Her body burned with fever, yet no medicine seemed to have any effect. The doctor examined her thoroughly but found nothing physically wrong, which made no sense, since just that morning she had been perfectly healthy. Word of Adele's condition reached the Emperor instantly. For once, he was shaken. Without hesitation, he left to see her himself. Meanwhile, deep within her unconscious state, Adele began to dream. She saw her people, standing before her, smiling warmly. Their voices told her to follow her own path. No matter what she chose, they would support her. Then the scene shifted. It became the moment they learned of her exile. Their expressions turned desperate, pleading for her not to leave, or at least, to take one of them with her. Adele knew the truth. This was a path she had to walk alone. Each of them had duties, responsibilities they could not abandon. And yet, they kept pleading. For a fleeting moment, doubt crept into her heart. Maybe she should have taken at least one of them, someone who could share even a sliver of her burden. Suddenly, Lionel's voice echoed through her dream, steady and unwavering. He promised to support her, no matter what path she chose. Even in her unconscious state, tears quietly slipped down her cheeks. The Emperor, watching her cry, was stunned. He had never imagined seeing Adele like this. She had always seemed cold, strong, and untouchable. Yet deep inside, a strange desire stirred within him. He wanted her to remain by his side, and if gentle persuasion wasn't enough, he resolved that he would make her stay, whether through subtle binding or by enclosing her within walls so vast she wouldn't even realize she was confined. At the same time, Lionel's heart sank the moment he heard the news. The Empress had collapsed. A servant rushed to him, explaining that 5 doctors were stationed outside her chambers, yet none had made any progress. Panic gnawed at him. He demanded every detail of her condition. And then, as if perfectly timed, a messenger from the Empress's palace arrived, telling him that Adele herself was summoning him. Confusion and dread mingled, but there was no time to hesitate. He had to go. When Lionel arrived, there she was, lying still on the bed, pale and fragile, as if the weight of the world had finally caught up with her. He dropped to his knees beside her, hands hovering over her, whispering, pleading, begging her to open her eyes. Finally, her lashes fluttered, and for a brief, precious moment she looked at him. Even in her weakened state, Adele's mind raced. She begged him to call someone from her homeland, at least one person, to help carry her burdens. She named specific people, insisting that any of them would come if called. But doubt swept over her just as quickly. Her trembling voice urged him to forget it all. She couldn't ask anyone to abandon their homeland or family for her sake. Her sense of duty remained as unyielding as ever, even in weakness. Her strength gave out again. As consciousness began to slip, Lionel caught her in his arms, holding her steady. At that heart-stopping moment, the Emperor stormed into the room. Before him, Lionel cradled the Empress. Surely the sight would make his jealousy spike once more. Rumors about the Empress's illness, and the Emperor visiting her frequently, spread like wildfire. At the same time, whispers about Diane grew sharper, people saying she had already lost her place in the palace, that her time was coming to an end. As for Diane, unease crept in, as she wondered where His Majesty had gone yet again. When she asked, the servants coldly informed her that he was at the Empress's palace. Their tone alone was enough. It was clear they no longer saw her the same way. Then, As if her day wasn't already going downhill, she saw her. A maid she had never seen before stepping out of the Emperor's bedroom. Blonde hair, blue eyes. The girl walked right past her without so much as a glance, as if Diane didn't even exist. Something twisted in her chest. She tried to stay calm, tried to tell herself it meant nothing, but the thought had already taken root. Little by little, she began to convince herself of the worst. She was about to be replaced. Back inside, the Emperor was demanding that Lionel explain why he had been in the Empress's room. Before things could escalate, Hannah stepped in, smoothly offering to take care of the Empress so the two men could speak properly. Lionel explained everything as calmly as he could. The Empress had summoned him, but she suddenly felt dizzy, and he simply caught her before she collapsed. Nothing more. Hannah backed him up, confirming that Adele had indeed called for him, and that she had already fallen asleep again. That seemed to settle things. For a while, both men stayed silent, watching over her. But even in silence, the tension remained. Lionel couldn't shake the thought. The Emperor had seen her like that, weak, unguarded, vulnerable. And for some reason, that bothered him more than it should have. He couldn't help but wonder what Karl thought when he saw her in that state. And if only he could, he would have erased that moment entirely. Karl, on the other hand, was already convinced that Lionel had feelings for his Empress. In response, he resolved to make it clear who she belonged to. When Hannah quietly approached Lionel, hinting that it might be best for him to step out, the Emperor stopped him. Sitting beside his wife, Karl gently stroked her face and ordered Lionel to bring a damp cloth. Lionel was visibly upset but couldn't refuse. Hannah offered to fetch it instead, but the Emperor declined, stating that Lionel, as the Empress's aide, was perfectly capable of handling such a task. Reluctantly, Lionel complied. Adele's condition mattered more. He returned shortly after with the cloth. Karl took it and carefully wiped his wife's face, deliberately brushing against her lips, making sure Lionel noticed. Lionel saw everything. Even though anger burned inside him, he held it back, focusing only on her recovery. Once Karl was done, he casually tossed the cloth back onto the tray Lionel was holding, as if asserting his authority. Then he stood and ordered that from now on, whenever the Empress was asleep, Lionel was to wait outside. Lionel had no choice but to comply. After stepping away, Lionel found a quiet spot to gather himself. That was when the thoughts started creeping in again. The Empress had called for him, not the Emperor, when she woke up earlier. That fact lingered in his mind. He also wondered whether Karl even realized that she considered this place like hell. Biting back his emotions, Lionel tried not to let them show, but the pain was still there. Later, Karl summoned a servant and demanded information about what had happened at the Baldur estate. Unfortunately, the man couldn't offer much, but he did confirm two things. First, Adele and Lionel had stayed in separate rooms. Second, the two of them had gone out alone together to the slums near the Nyavara River. That alone was enough to ruin the Emperor's mood. Without another word, he dismissed the servant and headed straight back to his office. Inside, Diane was already waiting. The moment she saw him, her face lit up, relieved that he had finally come. But that happiness didn't even last a second. Karl walked right past her. It was as if she wasn't even there. Still, she didn't leave. She remained where she was, quietly waiting for him to acknowledge her. And after what felt like forever, he finally did, asking what she was doing there. Diane struggled to respond, caught off guard by how cold he was acting. In the end, she simply said she missed him. Just then, the same blonde maid entered the study again. Diane watched her closely, curious about who she was. The maid approached the desk and quietly explained that she had come to retrieve some documents. She reported that she had completed her tasks and asked if she should clear them away. Karl didn't even look up. He simply agreed and casually praised her for doing a good job. That's when it clicked for Diane. Hannah's words echoed in her mind. The Empire was full of younger women who looked just like her. And suddenly that harmless maid didn't feel harmless at all. Once the maid left, Karl didn't bother keeping Diane around. He told her she could leave as well if she had nothing else to say. Thinking quickly, she pointed out that he had changed the maid handling his paperwork. She casually praised the girl, saying she seemed capable. then smoothly added that since she lacked servants now, perhaps she could have her instead. Karl agreed without hesitation. He said she could take the maid if she wanted. She thanked him, but internally, she had no intention of letting that opportunity go to waste. Not long after, she went straight to her brother and once again told him to keep a closer watch on the palace maids. However, he explained that such matters now fell under the authority of the Empress and Hannah, leaving him powerless. Ignoring that, Diane insisted that the maid handling the Emperor's documents be transferred to her, and that Lennox should deal with her. Her brother warned her that interfering with the Emperor's staff could end badly. But Diane clarified she wasn't planning anything extreme. She simply wanted to bribe the girl, silence her, and send her far away from the capital. Lennox hesitated, pointing out that if the Emperor suddenly called for the maid, it would cause problems. Diane cut him off, saying that by then it would already be too late, and demanded he handle it immediately. Soon enough, the blonde maid was seen sneaking out of the palace, doing her best to avoid attention. With Hannah's intervention, the maid managed to leave safely, escaping what could have easily turned into one of Diane's silent removal schemes. Of course, Diane was secretly pleased. Another potential rival had disappeared. When her loyal maid reported that the girl had simply packed her things and fled, Diane immediately put on a soft, fake, sympathetic expression. She even said she felt a little sorry for her. Lorraine, more practical, advised her to remain calm and focus on becoming pregnant instead. After some time, Adele slowly regained consciousness. Hannah rushed to her side immediately, checking on her condition. But instead of answering, Adele asked how long she had been unconscious. It had been 2 days. She hesitated before asking if, during that time, she had woken up and called for Lionel. Adele remembered what felt like a dream, begging him to bring someone from her homeland. But Hannah confirmed it wasn't a dream. It had really happened. The realization left Adele conflicted. Hannah also informed her that the Emperor had visited frequently, checking on her condition almost every hour. The scene shifted to Diane strolling through the palace when she unexpectedly ran into Karl in the hallway. She immediately noticed he was in a hurry and didn't even acknowledge her. She tried to stop him, wanting to ask where he was going, but he brushed past her without even letting her touch his hand and continued on. Following behind, Diane spotted one of his servants and quickly guessed that the Empress had woken up, which the servant confirmed. He added that he had just delivered the news to the Emperor, explaining why Karl rushed off. Hearing that, Diane's legs nearly gave out. She couldn't understand how Karl could treat her this way. Tears welled up as her heart felt like it was shattering into pieces. Meanwhile, the Emperor quickly arrived at Adele's room, eager to see her condition for himself. Adele already looked much better, standing by the window and staring outside. Karl immediately asked how she was feeling, and she admitted she felt much better. Still, she couldn't understand why he seemed so concerned and suspected he had some hidden motive. They soon sat down at a small table, and the Emperor asked if she had ever lost consciousness while she was in Kotrof. She shook her head, but he still insisted on arranging proper treatment and constant care from the doctors. Adele simply agreed. Anyway, Karl found himself staring at her. He thought her eyes sparkled like sunlight, her black hair flowed like silk, and her noble composure made her look flawless, making her undeniably beautiful. Adele noticed his gaze but didn't understand it, so she remained awkwardly silent. For some reason, the Emperor suddenly thought of his own mother and realized that the two women were completely different. He then murmured her name as if reminding himself that Adele was his empress. Whenever he saw the way she commanded a room with her imperial presence, he once thought he wanted to crush her before. But now he realized he was mistaken. If that were truly his intention, he wouldn't feel the urge to bow to her. He stepped closer and gently pressed a kiss to a strand of her hair. After that, Karl decided not to disturb her further. He wished her good health and proper rest before leaving the room. Adele silently watched him go, completely confused by his behavior. Just recently, he had been trying to control her, turn her into a passive empress, and now he was acting entirely differently. Then she remembered hearing him speak while she was unconscious. She immediately called for Hannah, asking if the Emperor had said anything during that time. Hannah apologized, explaining she wasn't present, but she did notice that the Emperor seemed to be developing new feelings for her. However, that wasn't what Adele needed. What she needed was power. Not something fragile built on the Emperor's affection, but power of her own. She recalled Lionel's advice about becoming an official mage, which would grant her a seat in the council. With that in mind, she decided to meet August again, and instructed Hannah to arrange it. At the same time, news of the Empress's recovery reached the Duchy of Baldur. The moment Lionel heard it, his emotions surged. He was ready to go see her immediately. But his brother stopped him, warning that the situation in the palace was tense. If the relationship between the Emperor and Empress changed, Lionel might need to step back. Lionel refused. He insisted it wasn't time to give up his position as her aide. Besides, they still needed information about the towers, and the Empress had plans for him. Even the Duke could tell that wasn't the only reason Lionel refused to step down. Elsewhere, Lennox visited his sister. He asked about her condition, having heard Diane was unwell, but when he entered, he found her in surprisingly good spirits. Then he noticed her holding her stomach and wondered if she might be pregnant. Diane revealed that the healer believed there was a strong possibility, though it was still early. She explained that her loss of appetite, nausea, and mood swings could all be signs. Lennox was thrilled. To him, this child could change everything. He even thought that the child had come at just the right moment. Now, all Diane could do was hope it was a boy. What once felt like hell was slowly starting to look like paradise for her. Back to the Empress, who was now preparing to leave. Hannah looked concerned, given that Adele had just recovered, but the Empress assured her it wouldn't take long. She ordered a maid to accompany her, and promised she would return soon. She then made her way to her meeting with the Duke. Upon arrival, she met a mage on duty and asked where the commander of the magic squad was. The mage informed her that he was in his office and offered to escort her. As Adele walked down the long hallway, the other mages bowed respectfully. Once she passed, they began whispering among themselves, convinced that she would soon receive an official rank. After all, she had single-handedly destroyed a tower, something no one had expected. Many had anticipated countless fallen knights, but instead, they had witnessed a burning tower and the Empress descending from it. Nothing like this had ever been seen before. To them, it was certain. She would be granted the recognition to become an official mage. Adele soon arrived at the office, where August greeted her warmly. She apologized for arriving unannounced, but he dismissed it and invited her to sit. He quickly guessed that she had come regarding his previous offer. August assumed she had decided to become the master of a tower, and she confirmed that she liked the idea of having control. The Duke explained that while her status already granted her many privileges, working with him could give her even greater power. However, she would first need official recognition as a mage. He clarified that in the Empire, such titles were earned through mage duels. Since she had already proven her strength by destroying a tower, her most suitable opponent would be the vice captain of the Mage Corps, Lennox. Adele realized this meant August was only baiting her, knowing full well that he wouldn't easily forsake both Diane and Lennox. So she asked what rank she would receive if she won, but the sly Duke told her that the rank could be decided later. For now, obtaining recognition as a mage was the priority. He admitted that assigning her a rank was complicated, as no one in the squad would realistically be able to command the Empress. He then told her to consider that she would soon become an official mage of the Empire. Clearly, he wasn't ready to let go of his own position as commander either. Adele wasn't particularly interested in recognition alone, unless it allowed her to participate in council meetings. She also questioned whether her association with Lionel might be used as a reason to exclude her, then added that they were both family, just as August had acknowledged. At that, August finally understood what she was aiming for. Internally, he remarked that Adele was no modest or innocent girl, but a wild lynx. Smiling, he acknowledged her as part of the royal family and promised to discuss the matter with the Emperor. Then Adele asked how they planned to deal with the towers that had sprung up in countless territories. The Duke explained that unlike Adele's homeland, where towers were destroyed as soon as they landed, she didn't fully understand their properties. According to him, towers could both be absorbed and summon other towers. When his plan was complete, he claimed, all mages would be able to fully utilize their power. And when that happened, a new era would begin, one in which non-mages would be reduced to second-class citizens. So that was how he planned to play the invincible god in the Empire. Moments later, the Empress walked away, feeling unsettled. That brief conversation had thrown her off completely. She still didn't understand what kind of property of the towers August had been talking about, but it was clear he intended to bring innocent people to their knees. Adele knew she had to stop him. Her thoughts were interrupted by a maid, who worried she might be unwell again. The Empress reassured her that she was fine. Just then, she heard Lionel calling her name. He admitted he had heard she'd woken up, but didn't understand why she was already out and strolling. The moment Lionel saw her, all the restless thoughts in his mind disappeared. A quiet sense of relief and happiness washed over him, as if he had been waiting for this moment. She greeted him with a smile, but Lionel couldn't help but worry. She looked a little pale. He suggested she get more rest, and offered to escort her back to the palace. She admitted that was exactly where she was heading. Without hesitation, Lionel removed his coat and draped it over her shoulders. She was caught off guard, but he simply said she might catch a cold and told her to wear it until she got back. The warmth wrapped around Adele felt comforting, almost like being held from behind. As they walked, Adele couldn't help but notice how well built he was. She asked if he was cold, but he assured her he was fine. Feeling the wind pick up, she realized he had been shielding her the entire time. It reminded her of the moment the tower first appeared after her arrival, how he had tried to catch her when she descended from the sky. He had always been there to support her. So she confessed she had never met anyone like him, neither in her homeland nor in Egmont. Adele apologized for asking him to bring someone from Kotrov. Lionel said he didn't mind, and would send people immediately if she permitted it. In truth, he both wanted to and didn't want to. His feelings were conflicted. She shook her head, telling him to forget about it. When they arrived at the palace, she returned his coat. Thanking him for keeping her warm, she invited him in for tea. Lionel declined, saying she needed rest. They parted ways, promising to see each other again. The scene shifted to the Kotrov Empire. The emperor had returned after a long absence following the former emperor's funeral and was immediately looking for Adele. But instead of his sister's warm smile, he was greeted by an empty room. The nanny explained that Adele had left and accepted a political marriage in Egmont about a month after he departed for the funeral. Lucio realized that both Adele and the nanny had known about the marriage, and he demanded to know why no one had told him. The nanny explained that Adele had ordered them to remain silent, and had left him a letter. Reading her apology letter, he broke down, calling his sister a fool. Soon, the Empress Dowager appeared, and he demanded to know why she had sent Adele to a foreign empire without consulting him. She replied that Adele deserved more than being tied to a minor noble family. Now she was an empress. She apologized for not informing him sooner, and claimed that Adele had gone willingly. Lucio didn't believe her. He knew exactly what their mother had used to blackmail Adele. His thoughts drifted back to when he was still a child. Back then, there were things he didn't understand, like why Adele would suddenly apologize to him out of nowhere. Whenever he asked why, she would simply smile. When Adele turned 14, she chose to lead the resistance against the towers despite their mother's objections. Their mother, who was still the empress at the time, acknowledged the organization, but insisted that the heir should prioritize safety. She demanded that Adele step down and pass leadership to Lucio. That decision effectively stripped Adele of her claim to the throne. But it also led to something worse. Some of her followers, desperate, proposed eliminating Lucio. Though Adele rejected the idea, they momentarily saw hesitation in her eyes and acted anyway. That moment of weakness nearly cost her brother his life. In the aftermath, her supporters were wiped out, burned to death. It was a tragedy that could have repeated itself again and again, as long as she remained in the empire. In her letter, Adele asked for forgiveness for her moment of doubt. By leaving, she believed she was both punishing herself and offering a final act of mercy. Lucio had already known the truth for a long time, but Adele didn't. Of course, the Empress Dowager knew it all along, which was why she used it to threaten Adele. Afterward, the young emperor summoned Cain and ordered him to go to the Egmont Empire. His mission was simple: find out how Adele was doing. If she was suffering, Cain was to bring her back immediately. Lucio wasn't bluffing. He was even prepared to start a war with Egmont if needed. Meanwhile, Karl was informed that Diane wished to see him, though she was too unwell to come herself. She had begged him to visit urgently. claiming it was something important. Concerned, Karl went to see her. Diane appeared frail as ever, her voice barely above a whisper, a sight that, quietly, started to irritate him. When he asked what she wanted, she motioned him closer. Taking his hand, she placed it on her belly and confessed. She believed she was pregnant. She explained that she hadn't been feeling well lately, and the symptoms pointed to early pregnancy. However, Karl remained silent. Diane grew nervous, asking why he wasn't reacting. His unreadable expression sent a chill down her spine. It wasn't what she had expected at all. Slowly, the Emperor pulled his hand away and asked if the palace doctor had confirmed it. She admitted that it hadn't been confirmed yet, but the signs were clear. The final result would be known in about a month. Hearing that, Karl simply turned and walked away. Diane tried to stop him, sensing that he wasn't pleased. Even then, he showed no sign of happiness. Quietly, he told her that he was glad, and that she should take care of herself before leaving. Diane collapsed to the floor, trembling, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. Memories clawed their way up. The story of Lady Beatrice, the Emperor's birth mother. She had given birth, yet her child was taken immediately. She was never acknowledged, never allowed to raise him. Karl had always pitied his mother for that. Diane had believed he would never let the same fate touch her. She had believed he would care for her differently. But the truth was unbearable. Even as Emperor, Karl had never corrected the records of his birth mother, despite having the absolute power to do so. It was a wake-up call. Every hope she had clung to crumbled. She finally understood. Karl had never wanted a child with her. Not now. Not ever. Cut to the scene where the Emperor summoned the imperial doctor. The physician firmly explained that he had prescribed the same medicine countless times before, and it had always worked flawlessly. He then cautiously admitted that Diane's diagnosis was not yet certain, meaning the earlier conclusion could easily have been mistaken. Karl fell into deep thought. If the Empress were to discover Diane's pregnancy, things would become far more complicated. Her already unstable position in the palace would suffer another massive blow the moment rumors spread. If that happened, he might become the only person she could lean on. Perhaps this was finally his opportunity to change her feelings toward him. Meanwhile, August calls Lennox in for a meeting. More than anyone, the Duke understands that without him, the siblings' lives would have turned out very differently years ago. His thoughts drift back to the past, to the moment he witnessed Lennox's magical powers awaken purely by chance. After the siblings lost their parents during a monster outbreak, August chose to take them in. That decision paid off tremendously. Lennox possessed extraordinary magical talent, and eventually became one of the key figures controlling the Mage Corps. Diane, on the other hand, used her sharp mind and stunning beauty to carefully navigate the Emperor's difficult personality, slowly tightening her influence around him little by little. But now Diane's value was beginning to decline. Karl's affection for her had noticeably cooled, and everyone around them could see the cracks forming. The Duke then asked Lennox a direct question. Could he defeat the Empress in a one-on-one battle? Lennox confidently declared that he was prepared to fight at any moment. Then, as if perfect timing, Lennox revealed what he called wonderful news. His sister Diane was pregnant with the Emperor's child. August immediately acted delighted upon hearing it. He praised Lennox and claimed he had never once doubted his capabilities. Since that was the case, there was no reason to disturb the Empress just yet. Instead, he suggested Diane return to the Ivory Palace, saying that an expecting mother deserved to rest somewhere far more comfortable. But behind that pleased expression, August was thinking something entirely different. He knew the Emperor's deepest insecurities better than anyone. Karl had always been painfully conscious of his own bloodline and status, which meant he would never willingly choose to have a child with a commoner like Diane. On top of that, it was highly suspicious that the usual preventative measures, like contraceptive medicine, had suddenly stopped without any explanation. Still, in August's eyes, the truth hardly mattered. Whether Diane was actually pregnant or not was irrelevant. What mattered was the announcement itself, because even the rumor of Diane carrying the Emperor's child would place enormous pressure on the Empress. As for the Empress, Adele quietly worried that Hannah would immediately scold her for sneaking out earlier. Thankfully, Adele had run into Lionel on the way back. If he hadn't wrapped his coat around her shoulders, her condition probably would have gotten much worse. The memory lingered in her mind. The warmth of his broad shoulders shielding her from the freezing wind felt strangely comforting. Adele had spent her entire life protecting others, always standing strong on her own without relying on anyone. But for the first time, being cared for by someone else made her genuinely happy. When Hannah finally asked where the Empress had gone, Adele answered that she had gone to meet with the Duke. Hannah immediately warned Adele to stay cautious around him, reminding her that he was the very man who had taken Lennox and Diane under his wing and supported them all these years. Then another problem arrived, when a document from the Imperial administration was delivered to Adele. According to the report, Diane had requested to rent the entire Ivory Palace for an unspecified amount of time. And the cost? Absolutely outrageous. The request alone was suspicious enough to make anyone raise an eyebrow. Somehow, whenever trouble started brewing, Adele's thoughts always drifted toward Lionel. Naturally, that led to the two meeting again almost immediately. Even though the documents had only been delivered an hour earlier, Lionel already knew everything about the Ivory Palace request. He explained that right after meeting with the Duke, Lennox had gone straight to the Imperial administration. From that alone, Lionel concluded that the Duke himself was most likely providing the funds for the rental. And knowing him, he would probably recover every coin later through the Imperial Ministry of Finance, which conveniently happened to be under his control. It sounded absurd. The deeper they looked into it, the clearer it became that the Duke's influence had spread like rot throughout the Empire. As Adele listened, she noticed the way Lionel looked at her. His eyes were filled with worry, an unmistakable affection. It didn't take her long to piece everything together. Diane was most likely pregnant, and the Duke intended to rent the Ivory Palace for her comfort and protection. Lionel felt as though someone had rubbed salt directly into an open wound. When Adele fell ill, the Emperor had been the one standing beside her, while Lionel could do nothing except watch helplessly from a distance. And now, once again, he hated how powerless he felt, unable to help her the way he wanted to. Still, Adele refused to crumble over the news. She had no intention of behaving like a shaken woman terrified of losing her place. And she certainly wasn't about to act desperate over producing an heir. Before long, news about the Ivory Palace rental reached the Emperor as well. The moment Karl heard it, he instantly realized that the Empress had already learned about Diane's pregnancy. He assumed her mood had darkened once again. Karl fully expected to receive the same cold treatment as before the moment he saw her. Deep down, he still believed one thing. When it came to supporting Adele, the only person she truly needed was him, not Lionel. Back at the Empress's palace, Hannah braced herself for the worst. After hearing the news about Diane's pregnancy, she expected Adele to be devastated. But surprisingly, the Empress looked completely calm. Adele gently took Hannah's hand and asked why she seemed more distressed than anyone else. She softly reassured her, insisting she truly was fine and not merely pretending to be strong. After all, Adele understood her position better than anyone. An empress was not simply the current emperor's wife or the mother of the future heir. Sooner or later, the emperor taking a concubine and producing children elsewhere had always been a possibility. There was no reason for her to panic now over something she had expected from the beginning. But one truth remained unavoidable. As empress, Adele could never completely escape the duty of bearing an heir herself. If only their wedding night hadn't been tangled with so many complicated emotions, she probably would have fulfilled that duty long ago. At that same moment, the Emperor arrived and noticed Adele standing alone on the balcony. Even after hearing such upsetting news, she remained composed and untouchable, carrying herself with the elegance expected of a true empress. Karl found himself strangely relieved by the sight and warmly called out to her. Soon the two sat down together for tea in private. From the moment they entered the room, Karl's eyes never left her face. He asked Adele to look at him directly and questioned whether she had already heard the rumors. When she said yes, he quickly assured her that there was no reason to let such gossip trouble her. Karl suddenly dropped to one knee before her. He declared that only Adele's child would ever inherit the throne as his rightful heir. Because of that, he insisted they needed to repair their relationship and move forward together as husband and wife. But of course, the conversation didn't end there. Karl also demanded that she distance herself from Lionel and stop visiting places like the slums altogether. According to him, such filthy and dangerous areas were no place for a woman of her status. The Emperor claimed Adel's curiosity about the slums had only been influenced by Lionel. In his eyes, those miserable places did not represent the true citizens of the Empire anyway. Adele immediately disagreed. She argued that the people suffering in the slums could not simply be abandoned and forgotten. If the towers were destroyed and displaced citizens could finally return to their homes, no one would willingly continue living in such horrific conditions. To make that happen, the towers themselves needed to disappear. Hearing that, Karl sharply asked whether Lionel had put those words into her mouth. Adele answered that no one had manipulated her. After witnessing the slums with her own eyes, she personally chose to visit them again. According to official reports, countless places across the Empire suffered just as badly. That was why she firmly believed the towers had to be destroyed. Karl's thoughts drifted back to his childhood. As a young prince, all he had ever wanted was recognition and affection from the former empress. But instead of praising him, she constantly ignored Karl, while admiring Lionel's noble bloodline and exceptional talent. Then came the Duke's poisonous words. The man repeatedly whispered that nobles would never truly bow to someone born from such low origins. Eventually, Karl became convinced that the towers themselves were the foundation of his authority as emperor. Without the monsters threatening the empire, the nobility would never have united under him, or acknowledged his rule. How could someone see disasters that destroyed innocent lives as political leverage? Adele unfolded a map and pointed towards several marked areas. The map displayed the expanding range of every active tower across the empire. There were barely any safe lands remaining. She warned him that if he continued building his authority upon the suffering of his own people, one day everything would inevitably collapse around him. Even then, Karl still failed to understand her. To him, Adele only needed to stay safely by his side and accept his protection. Yet instead, she insisted on throwing herself into dangerous battlefields and willingly walking into hell itself. Karl inwardly dismissed her determination. Yes, Adele may have destroyed a tower before, but in his opinion, it could not have been anything more than a medium priority one. Growing up as a princess, he also doubted she had ever truly experienced genuine hardship. That's why the Emperor made a decision. The next time a tower appeared, he wanted Adele to personally lead the charge. He intended to give her exactly what she claimed to desire, while he secretly looked forward to watch her fail. Once Adele experienced true despair firsthand, he believed she would finally stop talking about destroying the towers forever. At the palace of the Empress Dowager in Kotrov, an urgent message arrived, announcing that Cain and Ghibellin had secretly reached the port. Along with them came a personal letter sent by the Emperor himself. Adele's mother immediately understood his intentions. Most likely, the young emperor had written to his older sister, Adele, asking her to return home if life in Egmont became unbearable. But what he failed to realize was that sending Adele away had been just as painful for her mother. After all, Adele resembled her far too much. Yes, the mother and daughter often clashed over important beliefs. They rarely saw eye to eye on certain matters. But if Adele had simply thought the same way, her mother would have become Adele's greatest ally and strongest supporter in the first place. The more she thought about everything, the more heartbreaking it became. Adele was perfectly born to become an empress, yet at the same time, she was completely unsuited for that role. Someone as pure and upright as Adele could never truly survive in a world overflowing with corruption. Adele was the image of an ideal ruler, but ironically, someone like her could only fully exist in an ideal world. Before departing for Egmont, Adele had secretly taken poison from the imperial physician. That memory still haunted her mother. More than anything, she feared the possibility that she might never see her daughter alive again. Deep down, she already understood the truth long ago. Adele had chosen death over returning home in defeat. Meanwhile, across the sea, Adele's closest friends sailed toward Egmont aboard a ship. During the journey, Ghibellin openly complained that Cain should have confessed his feelings before Adele left. At the very least, he should have begged her to stay behind instead of letting her leave so easily. But Cain knew Adele far too well. Even if he had desperately clung to her and pleaded for her to remain, Adele still would have chosen the same path. Countless people had already tried to stop her before she departed, yet she rejected every single one of them without hesitation. There was only one possible way to bring Adele back to Kotrov now. She would have to be dethroned first. And just imagining that possibility alone was enough to make Ghibellin's blood boil with anger. As for Cain, Only one thought stayed in his mind throughout the entire voyage. At the end of this journey, he would finally see Adele again, the woman who remained dearest to his heart. Back at the palace, Adele told Hannah that she wanted to step outside alone for a while and get some fresh air. Hannah immediately frowned. It was already getting late, and the thought of the Empress wandering around alone at night made her uneasy. She quickly warned Adele not to go too far. In response, Adele gently promised that she would stay nearby and return before dark fully settled in. Truthfully, Hannah's worry came from more than simple concern. The longer she stayed beside Adele, the more the Empress reminded her of Princess Elisabetta, and that similarity frightened her. So what exactly happened to the princess in the end? Although Liz's marriage to Duke Baldur had originally been arranged, the two had lived together quite happily for years. Yet, despite that, their marriage suddenly ended in divorce, and Liz eventually returned to her own territory as if she had been driven out of the capital, only for Hannah to discover the real reason behind it later. August and Karl had attempted to pass a law stripping the spouses of royal women of all political authority. Liz immediately realized what would happen next. Rather than waiting helplessly for the situation to worsen, she boldly chose divorce and abandoned the capital on her own terms before they could corner her completely. Meanwhile, as Adele wandered through the palace grounds, her thoughts remained trapped on the Emperor's earlier words. Karl had turned the towers into the very foundation of his authority. She understood that he wanted to use the towers to control the nobility through fear and dependence. But was that truly the only reason? There were simply too many towers, far too many for their existence to serve only political purposes. So why was he really allowing this to continue? And while the Emperor protected his throne, what about the countless innocent people suffering because of those towers every single day? Lost in thought, Adele suddenly lifted her gaze, only to find Lionel appearing before her once again, perfectly timed as always. Lionel asked where she was headed, and Adele casually answered that she only wanted a short walk. She added that if he happened to be going the same way, they could keep each other company. Even while walking beside her, Lionel remained concerned. Earlier, Adele had looked visibly shaken, but now she carried herself with her usual confidence again. Somehow that only worried him more. He could not shake the feeling that she was forcing herself to appear fine. Lionel suddenly mentioned the 3 people from Kotrov whom Adele trusted the most, then asked if she wanted him to bring them to Ekmont any time. His kindness felt like a warm blade slipping gently into Adele's heart, exposing the part she had tried hardest to hide. And that was exactly why Lionel was dangerous to her. With a soft smile, Adele praised him for being such a capable assistant who constantly looked after her. She then explained that the 3 people he mentioned were the companions who once fought beside her to destroy towers back in Kotrov. Among them was Cain, the only son and heir of his family. Because he insisted on fighting alongside Adele in dangerous tower raids, his father repeatedly came to complain and begged her to expel Cain from the anti-tower headquarters. Yet despite all the protests, Cain remained one of the most talented people when it came to destroying towers. Lionel only pretended to be interested in her stories about Kotrov. In truth, he simply wanted to keep hearing Adele speak, and to see her smile a little longer. And somewhere deep inside, he wondered what would happen if Adele ever discovered how he truly felt about her. Suddenly, Adele asked where he had bought the coat he lent her earlier. She admitted it was incredibly warm and comfortable, and wondered if the same place also made coats for women. Before Lionel could properly respond, Adele stepped a little closer. She commented that his cologne smelled surprisingly pleasant. Or perhaps, she simply liked Lionel's natural scent more than she realized. Without even noticing what she was doing, Adele leaned in slightly as though to breathe in the fragrance, only to abruptly regain her senses a second later. For that brief moment, they no longer looked like an empress and her loyal assistant, just a man and a woman standing together. As they continued walking side by side, Lionel silently wished the moment would never end. At the same time, Diane made her way into the Emperor's office. With obvious excitement, she happily announced that she would be returning to the Ivory Palace that very day. After all, she did not want her child to be born as an illegitimate heir. In a softer voice, Diane asked whether Karl would visit them from time to time and speak to the baby. She said a child deserved to feel loved by both parents, and admitted she feared being abandoned. Karl slowly rose from his seat and glared at her coldly. Fury flickered across his face as he reminded Diane that he had warned her countless times never to speak like that again. He told her she should have been satisfied with receiving his affection instead of constantly asking for more. At that point, Diane could no longer hold back her frustration. The day she had been thrown out of the palace, Karl had not even bothered to visit her once or ask whether she was all right. Tears welled in her eyes as she leaned against his chest, asking what she had possibly done to deserve being treated so cruelly. But instead of comforting her, Karl pushed her away and ordered her to leave immediately. That response hurt far more than the rejection itself. As Diane walked out of the office, she suddenly crossed paths with a maid with blonde hair and blue eyes, heading toward the Emperor's chambers. Just seeing another woman who resembled her was enough to send Diane's anxiety spiraling upward. Later on, Lennox informed her that the Duke had spent an outrageous amount of money just to move her back into the Ivory Palace. Diane let out a bitter laugh. To her, the Duke was nothing more than a cunning snake waiting for the perfect chance to use them completely, squeeze every last bit of value from them, and discard them the moment they became useless. Because of that, she warned Lennox never to lower his guard around him. Then Diane brought up the blonde-haired, blue-eyed maid she had seen near the Emperor's office earlier, and coldly told her brother to get rid of the girl. According to Diane, situations like this needed to serve as a warning before this trend spread any further. But that wasn't all. Diane added one more thing. If the opportunity ever appeared, it would be better to kill the Empress entirely and remove her from the picture for good. Meanwhile, in the territory of Marquise Vieta, life carried on peacefully as usual. The townspeople went about their daily routines, merchants filled the streets, and children happily ran around playing hide-and-seek without a care in the world. Then everything changed in an instant. A tower suddenly appeared. Panic exploded across the territory as terrified screams spread through the streets. The Marquis wasted no time. He began shouting orders, commanding all residents in the southern district to evacuate at once. The fortress gates had to be opened immediately, and everyone capable of fighting was ordered to prepare for the incoming wave of monsters. At the same time, emergency signals were sent out. The beacon fire was lit, and carrier pigeons were dispatched to notify the capital about the newly descended tower. Now, all they could do was endure the attack for as long as possible, and pray reinforcements arrived before it was too late. Elsewhere in the palace, the cunning Duke paid Adele a visit. His true purpose was obvious. He wanted to see whether the news of Diane's pregnancy had shaken the Empress badly enough to break her composure. Adele saw straight through his act from the very beginning. So instead of reacting emotionally, she merely thanked him politely for his concern. At first, it seemed August had not fully decided whether to support Adele or the blonde siblings. However, after secretly funding Diane's stay in the Ivory Palace, Adele became certain the Duke had finally made his choice the moment he heard about the pregnancy. Still, August's visit had another purpose as well. He came to crush Adele's hopes of attending the council meetings. Allowing her to receive mage accreditation was already troublesome enough, but under no circumstances could he permit Adele to actively destroy towers too. If she succeeded, the Baldur family would undoubtedly use that achievement as justification to demand her participation in the council meetings. Calmly, Adele declared that she was fully prepared to receive her accreditation and begin working immediately. The Duke smoothly assured her that everything would be arranged soon, while Adele silently waited for him to finally admit that she would never be allowed to take part in council affairs. Before the conversation could continue, the doors suddenly burst open. Hannah and a knight hurried inside carrying urgent news. A new tower had descended in Marquise Vieta's territory, placing countless civilians in immediate danger. For the first time, August visibly lost his composure. Unable to hide his shock, he quickly excused himself, claiming he needed to deal with the crisis immediately. That reaction alone made Adele suspicious. After all, when Count Calvin previously begged for assistance, the Duke had completely ignored the request. So why act so urgently this time? August insisted there was no time to waste, and that every second mattered. However, before he could leave, the knight revealed there was still one more matter to address first. He had come carrying a direct imperial order for the Empress herself. The Emperor commanded Adele to participate in the tower expedition and assist in destroying it. August immediately tried to stop her. He warned Adele that expeditions were far too dangerous for an empress, and insisted she should not involve herself. Adele remained completely calm. She assured him there was nothing to worry about. then asked whether the Duke perhaps had another reason for trying so hard to keep her away from the fight. That single question left him cornered. In the end, August had no choice but to allow Adele to go. Though inwardly, he cursed Karl for this decision. Instead of tightening control over the Empress, the Emperor had unknowingly opened the very door Adele needed. The moment the deployment order was issued, the entire military camp sprang into action. The Empire had mobilized some of its strongest units for this mission: the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the Imperial Guard, the 1st Striker Battalion, and the 1st Keeper Battalion. These were not ordinary troops. They were among the most elite and prestigious military forces in the entire Empire, all gathered to destroy the massive first-level tower. However, August still refused to give up on persuading Adele to stay behind. He continued warning her about the dangers awaiting them during the expedition. Proper shelters would be scarce, the roads would be exhausting, and there was even a chance she would have to sleep outdoors like the soldiers. At this point, the man looked one step away from physically locking the palace gates himself. Adele simply laughed softly at his endless worrying. She teasingly admitted that she no longer knew how to escape from his constant concern. With confidence, she reassured everyone that she was fully prepared to leave. Traveling without proper rest did not frighten her in the slightest. Turning toward Lionel, she promised him that everything would be fine. Not long after, Hannah also approached with a worried expression and asked Adele to return safely. In response, the Empress mounted her horse with practiced ease, moving so naturally that it almost looked effortless. She loudly ordered the troops to move out. The Emperor's eyes followed Adele's troops as memories of his earlier conversation with August resurfaced. The Duke had questioned why Karl chose to send the Empress into battle without consulting him beforehand. At the time, Karl simply answered that there was no issue since both August and Lennox were joining the expedition as well. Deep down, Karl hoped this dangerous journey would finally force Adele to come to her senses. He wanted her to realize that the only place she could truly feel safe was by his side. Anyway, as the expedition departed from the capital, Hannah also remained behind. She stood in front of Adele's now empty chair, reflecting on everything she had witnessed during her years of service. But no matter how much she thought about it, one thing still felt unbelievable. Never before had she seen an empress personally join a tower expedition. All Hannah could do now was pray for Adele's safe return. However, her thoughts were suddenly interrupted when a maid entered and informed her that Diane was already waiting in the sitting room. A bad feeling immediately settled in the air. Soon afterward, Hannah entered the room and asked why Diane had come to visit. Diane replied that she wanted to discuss something personal. Hannah remained standing the entire time, clearly expecting Diane to stop wasting time and reveal her true purpose already. And then Diane finally did. Coldly, she asked Hannah if she remembered saying that Lady Beatrice resembled her. Diane wanted Hannah to understand that she was nothing like Beatrice, who had merely been replaceable. Soon, she would give birth to the Emperor's child, and unlike Beatrice, she would not die so easily. Without even trying to hide her hostility anymore, Diane openly threatened Hannah. Once she became the mother of the Emperor's heir, the very first thing she planned to do was throw Hannah out of the palace entirely. After the expedition group finally arrived at their destination, Lionel immediately guided Adele toward her tent. Seeing how long the journey had been, he quietly suggested that she should rest for the remainder of the day since the ride must have exhausted her. Adele simply smiled and replied that Lionel was free to rest as well. Of course, rest was clearly the last thing on his mind. Before leaving, Lionel personally instructed a trusted knight to stay near the Empress at all times, oversee her safety, and tighten the surrounding security. As night fell over the camp, Lennox secretly summoned one of his subordinates. In a low voice, he ordered the man to travel southwest toward Viscount Rohan's territory, before proceeding to a specific location marked on a piece of paper. Most importantly, the envelope he carried had to be delivered personally. To Lennox, the timing felt almost too perfect. He never expected such an ideal opportunity to arrive this quickly. In his mind, he could already picture Diane praising him for being such a dependable brother. Because before the expedition even fully reached the Marquise's territory, the Empress, whom Diane despised so deeply, would already be dead. And even better, all suspicion would point toward Lionel. On the other hand, refugees from neighboring settlements continued flooding nonstop into Grande territory. Word had spread that the region was accepting and helping displaced citizens, which only attracted even more desperate people seeking shelter. Before long, the territory became overcrowded, and supplies slowly began running short. Unlike everyone else, Liz immediately understood what was really happening. She recognized it as yet another scheme orchestrated by her uncle, the Duke. A man who cared for nothing except himself and his own wealth. There wasn't a single thought for the Empire's future inside that twisted mind of his. He refused to carry the responsibilities of the throne, yet still greedily desired influence equal to the Emperor himself. And the worst part? The Emperor had already become little more than the Duke's puppet. Realizing the situation could no longer be ignored, Liz finally made her decision. She needed to head to the capital and speak directly with the Empress. Back with Adel's expedition group, they had finally entered the mana radius surrounding the newly descended tower. The mana radius referred to the area influenced by the tower's overflowing magical energy. Once mages stepped inside that zone, they could draw power directly from the mana leaking out of the tower itself. It was also the area where monsters could exist, since such creatures only appeared in places heavily saturated with magic. Oddly enough, every time Adele entered a mana radius, she experienced two completely opposite emotions at once. An intoxicating sense of freedom, and crushing guilt she could never fully escape. Just then, Lionel entered the Empress's tent and quietly asked if she was comfortable. Adele assured him she was perfectly fine and promised to call for him immediately if she needed anything. Eventually, the camp grew quiet for the night. But the moment Adele drifted into sleep, her eyes suddenly snapped open. She couldn't move, not even a finger. This wasn't ordinary sleep paralysis. Some powerful force of mana had completely restrained her body, pinning her down so thoroughly that even breathing felt difficult. Then she saw a man stood silently before her bed, gripping a blade while staring directly at her. Before the assassin could strike, Adele instantly surged upward and grabbed him by the throat. Coldly, she remarked that they really should have hired a better mage for such an important mission. Unfortunately, she never got the chance to interrogate him. The man immediately collapsed and died after biting down on a poison pill hidden in his mouth. Adele realized that the assassin hadn't acted alone. Someone nearby had assisted him using magic. Immobilizing her so perfectly from a distance required an incredibly skilled mage with precise control over mana. And there were not many people capable of that. So, Adele headed toward Lionel's tent to discuss the situation. However, when she arrived, she found him still deeply asleep. For a brief moment, she awkwardly hesitated about waking him. Carefully, she reached out and lightly touched his shoulder, only for Lionel to react instantly on instinct. In one swift motion, he grabbed her wrist and pinned her onto the bed beneath him. Still half asleep, Lionel struggled to understand whether he was dreaming or whether the Empress was truly inside his tent. Golden eyes shimmered before him like sunlight. Soft red lips looked almost unreal at such close distance. Surely, and this couldn't possibly be reality. Slowly, Lionel lowered his face closer until barely an inch remained between them. Adele loudly called his name again, and immediately the spell was broken. She awkwardly apologized for sneaking into his tent so suddenly and startling him into defending himself. With visible embarrassment, she asked him to release her hands, which he was still holding tightly. Lionel finally regained his senses completely and apologized, while Adele insisted the misunderstanding was entirely her fault for appearing without warning in the middle of the night. Only then did she reveal the real reason she had come. An assassin had entered her tent. The two hurried back immediately, but by the time they arrived, someone had already removed the body in an attempt to erase all evidence. Still, traces of blood remained behind. Adele pointed out that very few mages possessed enough ability to immobilize her so completely. Whoever orchestrated the attack was both highly skilled and dangerously bold. Lionel named the only two people powerful enough to accomplish something like that: August and Lennox. But he doubted the Duke would act so recklessly while traveling together on a tower expedition. Because of that, Lionel believed Lennox had most likely acted on his own. Even without solid proof, Lionel insisted the assassination attempt needed to be officially reported. At the very least, exposing the incident would make Lennox think twice before trying anything again. But Adele stopped him. She firmly asked Lionel not to tell anyone. If word spread, the Duke would likely hold Lionel responsible as commander of the guards for failing to protect her properly. Naturally, Lionel argued that Adele's safety mattered far more than his own position. But Adele refused to change her mind. After such a disastrous failure, she believed Lennox would not risk attempting a second attack anytime soon anyway. And without a body left behind, they had no evidence to prove anything. In the end, Adele simply told Lionel to get some rest. Lionel had no intention of sleeping peacefully after hearing any of this. Instead, he insisted on standing guard outside her tent personally to ensure her safety through the night. After he finally left, Adele sat quietly on the edge of her bed. Without meaning to, she remembered the way Lionel had looked at her moments earlier, those affectionate eyes, and that dangerously close distance between them. If she hadn't called his name back then, what exactly would have happened next? For some reason, just remembering it made her feel hot. That same night, Lennox quietly monitored the area from the shadows. Before long, he realized the Empress had chosen not to report the assassination attempt to the others. Fortunately for him, the assassin had also taken his own life before being captured. Still, one thing continued bothering him. Adele had managed to resist his spell, and that was no small matter. Lennox was considered the Empire's finest striker, yet the Empress had broken free from his magic almost instantly. That could only mean one thing. Adele was not merely a striker. She was also an elite-level keeper. Someone with abilities like hers could easily become a serious threat to him in the future. That was why Lennox decided that Adele needed to disappear as soon as possible. Elsewhere in the camp, a red-haired mage named Brunhild Alexa noticed the sudden increase in security around the Empress's tent. Immediately, her instincts told her something suspicious had happened. Judging from the timing, she wondered whether the Duke had finally started making his move. Alexa herself was known as the second strongest striker in the Empire. Yet despite her overwhelming talent, she'd always despised the Empire's methods for handling towers. For years, she proposed creating permanent jurisdictions across the Empire, where mages could be stationed and deployed more efficiently whenever towers appeared. It was a smart idea, but nobody listened. Not because her plan lacked merit, but because she was an orphan raised in the slums. So Alexa waited patiently. Over the years, she secretly gathered information while searching for the perfect opportunity to act. She also formed connections with others inside the Mage Corps, people who shared her dissatisfaction with the Duke's rule. Now, after watching Adel closely, Alexa finally saw some hope. She believed the Empress might become the person capable of cutting away the Empire's rotting flesh so that something entirely new could finally grow in its place. By morning, August was already in a foul mood from the exhausting journey. Irritated, he questioned why the tower had descended in such an inconvenient location of all places. But despite his frustration, he reminded himself to remain patient if he wanted his plans to succeed perfectly. Then, he unfolded a massive map. Scattered across it were countless markings. The black dots represented the locations of the currently existing towers. The red dots, however, marked the places where August personally intended for future towers to descend. And eventually, every location on that map would become home to a tower. When that day arrived, August believed the Empire would evolve into the world's first true mage nation, a country where mages could freely wield magic anywhere without restriction. Towers were mysterious entities whose magical influence affected not only existing towers, but future ones yet to appear as well. Using the knowledge only he possessed, August had secretly been manipulating where towers would descend all along. However, Vietas had never been part of his plan. A tower appearing there posed a serious problem. If things spiraled out of control, even his own territory could eventually be threatened. Still, according to his calculations, once the tower in Vietas was destroyed, the next tower should descend directly inside the capital itself. And that outcome was exactly what he wanted. After all, a tower appearing in the heart of the Empire would provide the perfect excuse. The only legal excuse to freely unleash magic within the capital itself. Moments later, monsters began pouring out of the tower in the Marquise's territory. The creatures charged straight toward the civilians, turning the once peaceful land into complete chaos. Knights desperately fought to hold the line while trying to calm the terrified citizens, assuring them that reinforcements from the capital were already on their way. They only needed to survive a little longer. Then suddenly, a massive wyvern burst from the tower. Instant panic spread everywhere as people screamed and fled in every direction. But before the monster could attack, a brilliant beam of magical light shot across the sky, and the wyvern came crashing violently to the ground. Reinforcements had finally arrived. Adele stepped forward before the stunned marquise, who stared at her in disbelief and immediately demanded to know who she was. After Adele introduced herself, realization finally struck him. The woman standing before him was the Empress herself. At the same time, Lionel efficiently directed the troops with flawless precision, assigning knights to their positions while reorganizing the battlefield almost instantly. Nearby, Alexa frowned deeply as she questioned the Duke. More and more monsters continued flooding out of the tower, yet the mages were still standing by doing nothing while ordinary knights risked their lives. Why weren't they helping? August coldly silenced her and told her they would proceed exactly as they always had. So, while Lionel ordered the knights to maintain formation and avoid the descending horde of ogres, the mages continued watching the battlefield safely from a distance as the knights struggled on their own. Adele could no longer stay silent. Angrily, she demanded to know why the mages were merely standing by and observing. August simply replied that everyone had their assigned role. The knights existed to clear a path, while the mages' duty was only to destroy the tower itself. That was all. As the fighting intensified, monsters continued overwhelming the battlefield while the knights sacrificed themselves to create an opening for the mages. Innocent lives were being treated as disposable tools for a foolish strategy. The Empress finally understood the horrifying truth. The mages had never truly prioritized destroying the monsters, nor saving the people. Adele suddenly jumped off her horse, making Lionel immediately shout that it was too dangerous. But Adele firmly told them she would hold back the monsters herself while Lionel and the others opened a path to the tower. She knew the technique would put a huge strain on her body, but she could no longer stand by and watch innocent people die. Using her sword as a mana amplifier, Adele drove her magic into the ground itself. Mana spread outward beneath the battlefield like invisible waves rushing toward the monsters. In the very next instant, every creature froze completely in place, and the entire horde stopped moving. Lionel reacted immediately. While Adele restrained the monsters, he ordered the 1st Battalion to advance directly toward the tower, while the 2nd Battalion handled the ogres and secured the rear. Thanks to their coordination, a safe road to the tower opened almost instantly. For the first time in her life as a mage, Alexa witnessed a path to the tower that did not require mountains of corpses to carve out. Only then did August finally order the mages to move forward and destroy the tower. Adele remained standing at the center of it all, but her strength was rapidly disappearing. She had already pushed herself far beyond her limit, yet she desperately forced her body to endure just a little longer. Within seconds, the tower exploded. Lennox triumphantly raised his hand and proudly declared that victory belonged to them once again. Lionel rushed straight toward Adele and shouted that it was over now, that she could finally stop. Even until the very end, Adele refused to let go of her sword. Her only focus was protecting the people around her, until her body finally gave out. Blood spilled from her mouth as she collapsed, and Lionel barely caught her before she hit the ground. Panic instantly filled his voice as he shouted that Adele had exhausted too much mana and was already suffering from internal bleeding. Carrying Adele in his arms, Lionel ordered everyone to follow him at once. They decided to move her immediately to the Marquise's estate for treatment. Whispers quickly spread among the knights as they endlessly praised the Empress. Without her, the casualties would have been devastating. Countless innocent people survived only because she chose to step onto the battlefield herself. For the first time, the Duke's schemes had completely backfired. After everything he did to humiliate Adele, no one could have imagined it would only make the people admire her even more. Inside the room, Lionel carefully laid Adele onto the bed. The Empress remained unconscious, her body completely drained after forcing herself far beyond her limits. Nearby, Alexa explained that all they could do now was hope Adele had not suffered any severe internal damage. She then asked Lionel to step outside for a moment, so they could begin treating the Empress immediately. Meanwhile, the Marquise could not hide his concern, and quickly asked Lionel about Adele's condition. Since the doctor was already attending to her, he suggested that Lionel should rest as well after the exhausting battle. But Lionel had no intention of leaving. When the Marquise first heard that Lionel had become the Empress's aide, he assumed the Balder family must have been cornered politically somehow. Otherwise, a man like Lionel would never have accepted such a position. But after witnessing everything that happened today, he realized he had completely misunderstood the situation. Later on, the doctor explained that the Empress needed complete rest for the time being. She should only eat light meals while recovering, and medicine would be prepared to help treat her internal injuries. Throughout the entire explanation, Alexa carefully memorized every instruction without missing a single detail. Then Lionel approached the doctor. He demanded to know Adele's exact condition. Somehow, the man possessed a natural ability to intimidate people simply by staring at them. The poor doctor nearly looked ready to confess crimes he hadn't even committed. Nervously, he explained that although the Empress had indeed suffered internal injuries, her life was not in danger. As long as she rested properly, she should recover soon. Only then did some of the tension leave Lionel's expression. The Marchioness approached him and quietly noticed how worried he truly was. Gently, she told Lionel that fresh clothes and a room had already been prepared for him, encouraging him to get some proper rest as well. Lionel politely thanked her for the consideration, then immediately refused. Until his deputy arrived, he intended to remain right there beside the Empress. After the Marchioness personally helped care for the unconscious Adele, alongside the maids, she stepped outside the room and was startled to find numerous knights gathered nearby, all anxiously asking about the Empress's condition. Most were still covered in dirt, sweat, and traces of battle from earlier. These were the very men who had rushed in to save the territory without hesitation, and the Marchioness felt genuinely grateful toward every one of them. Still, she politely reminded the knights that the Empress desperately needed rest right now. She informed them that warm meals had already been prepared, and proper beds were waiting for them as well. Then she practically ordered them to go wash themselves and rest properly for once. Even the Marchioness found herself surprised. At what point had the Empress managed to earn such deep loyalty and trust from so many people? Not everyone was pleased by how events had turned out. In fact, the Duke was absolutely furious. Because of what happened on the battlefield, the knights would now begin siding with the Empress. Worse still, nobles terrified of the growing tower threat would naturally start supporting both Adele and the Baldur family as well. Everything was shifting in Adele's favor, and August hated it. Without delay, he summoned Lennox to discuss their next move. Pulling the young man closer, the Duke lowered his voice and whispered that the Empress needed to be eliminated immediately. To the northwest of the territory stood a slum settlement roughly an hour away by carriage. August ordered Lennox to send someone there at once. Even if Adele was an exceptionally powerful mage, her body was currently weakened from overusing mana. In her condition, she would not be able to properly wield magic. A skilled assassin should be enough to finish the job. However, after the complete disaster of the first assassination attempt, Lennox had already realized that both Adele and Lionel would naturally remain cautious from then on, which was exactly why he chose not to tell the Duke about his earlier failure. Admitting he already tried and failed once sounded like an excellent way to get himself strangled on the spot. Unaware of Lennox's previous scheme, the Duke confidently believed no one would suspect another attack so soon. Besides, Lionel could not possibly stand guard inside the Empress's room forever, so August intended to make everything appear perfectly natural. Adele would simply fail to recover from her injuries and quietly die in her sleep. Lennox could only nod nervously and obey the Duke's orders without protest. Inside the dining hall, the knights gathered around the tables while excitedly talking about the battle earlier that day. Nearly every conversation somehow returned to the same topic: how heroically the Empress had faced the tower and saved countless lives. Then Lionel entered the hall. He announced that he needed volunteers to guard the Empress's chambers through the night. To his surprise, every single knight instantly raised a hand without hesitation. The man probably could have asked them to fight another tower immediately, and half the room would still volunteer first. Lionel instructed Henry to select only those still physically capable of standing guard. The chosen knights were stationed outside Adele's room, throughout the corridors, and even along the terrace surrounding the estate. But Lionel still wasn't satisfied. He also ordered a complete inspection of every person currently staying within the estate grounds. Anyone behaving suspiciously was to be detained immediately. Because while Adele remained unconscious, Lionel understood one thing perfectly clearly. The people who wanted her dead would see this moment as the ideal opportunity to strike again. By midnight, chaos quietly unfolded inside the estate. The head maid suddenly collapsed to the floor after being attacked, while a cloaked stranger stood over her body in silence. Nearby, another maid witnessed the horrifying scene firsthand, but fear froze her completely. She couldn't even scream. The attacker, disguised as a maid, ordered the terrified servant to stay quiet before forcing her to accompany her toward Adele's room. Soon, Lionel crossed paths with the same maids arriving for their work shift. One of them politely explained that they had come to begin their duties, though the head maid was strangely nowhere to be found. At first glance, everything seemed normal, but then Lionel noticed something odd. Among them stood a dark-haired maid with green eyes whom he had definitely never seen before, while the maid beside her looked visibly nervous. Immediately suspicious, Lionel questioned them carefully, asking whether anything unusual had happened, or if anyone had behaved strangely. Then he repeated the same question again, while deliberately watching the unfamiliar maid's reaction. But the maid calmly answered no. The Empress's condition had finally begun stabilizing. Her breathing was steady, and thankfully, no serious complications had appeared so far. Still, Lionel could not get rid of the uneasiness tightening in his chest. Then the maids politely informed him they needed privacy to change the Empress's clothes and requested that he wait outside for a moment. Though still wary, Lionel cautiously agreed and stepped out of the room. The instant the door closed behind him, the green-eyed maid coldly warned the terrified servant beside her to stay silent, unless she wanted something terrible to happen. The assassin had already prepared a deadly poison. It would slowly kill from the inside by triggering a severe fever, making Adele's death appear completely natural. Everyone would simply assume the Empress succumbed to complications from overusing mana during battle. A perfect plan. Unfortunately for her, Lionel had never truly lowered his guard. Even after leaving the room, he only stepped away briefly while continuing to search for the missing headmaid. Then suddenly, one of the knights came rushing down the corridor with urgent news. They had discovered a body believed to belong to the missing maid. Without hesitation, he kicked open Adele's door and found the assassin gripping the Empress's head while attempting to force poison into her mouth. The terrified maid immediately broke down screaming, revealing that the woman had murdered the headmaid and needed to be captured immediately. Realizing the mission had failed, the assassin attempted to flee through the window. The moment she stepped outside, she realized that every possible escape route had already been surrounded. It was almost as if the knights had been waiting for an assassin to appear all along. Behind her, Lionel was already there. Coldly, he ordered her not to move. He seized the woman and demanded to know who had ordered the assassination attempt against the Empress. The assassin already understood her fate. If captured alive, she would be tortured endlessly until she revealed everything. So instead, she bit down on the hidden poison pill concealed inside her mouth. Within seconds, she died, and with her, the identity of the mastermind vanished as well. The Marquis and his wife rushed into the courtyard in complete shock, asking whether someone had truly attempted to murder the Empress within their own estate. Of course, the Duke arrived as well. Outwardly, he loudly expressed outrage that anyone would dare attack the Empress. He questioned how an unknown woman managed to obtain a maid's uniform and infiltrate the estate unnoticed. The Marchioness desperately tried to explain that although the assassin wore servant clothing, she had never actually belonged to their staff. But August relentlessly pressured her, insisting such explanations no longer mattered. As the eldest member of the imperial family, he claimed he could never allow an incident of this scale to pass without consequences. In reality, August had another reason for interfering. He needed control over the investigation, before Lionel uncovered too much. Just then, one of the maids tearfully revealed that the head maid had died. The Marchioness nearly collapsed after hearing the news. The head maid had originally come from the Saxon family and had been incredibly close to the Marchioness, almost like a sister to her. On top of that, the estate had only learned of the Empress's arrival that very same day, making it absurd to believe they had planned any attack against Adele. Still, August pushed Lionel to hand over the investigation to him. Lionel refused immediately. As the Empress's aide, and the person directly responsible for her safety during the expedition, he declared that he would personally interrogate everyone involved until he uncovered the truth behind the assassination attempts. Furious, August went straight to confront Lennox afterward. Despite spending enormous amounts of money and arranging everything carefully, Lennox still failed to kill an unconscious Adele lying helplessly in bed. The only fortunate part was that the assassin had committed suicide before revealing anything. However, August now realized something deeply troubling. Unknown to him, Lionel had already verified the identities of all the maids beforehand, which meant Lionel may have anticipated the assassination attempt from the very beginning. Suspicion immediately turned toward Lennox. The Duke subtly accused him of secretly targeting the Empress behind his back without permission. Perhaps Diane herself had pressured Lennox into eliminating Adele. But Lennox quickly denied everything, insisting he would never betray the Duke. August gave him a chilling warning. If Diane's wishes ever became more important than the Duke's own orders, then that alone would be considered betrayal. Moments later, Lionel informed the maids that he wished to see the Empress for a moment. In truth, he was completely exhausted. The endless incidents surrounding Adele weighed heavily on his mind, and no matter how hard he tried, he could not stop worrying about her. To him, Adele resembled a raging river overflowing beyond its banks, and the longer he stayed beside her, the more it felt as though the raft keeping him safely afloat was drifting farther away, until eventually it would be swallowed entirely by the current. For the very first time, Lionel seriously questioned whether he should step down from his position as her aide. Lionel then noticed the sweat covering Adele's cheek as she lay unconscious. Without meaning to, he remembered how the Emperor had once gently wiped away her sweat with his own hands. But Lionel was only an aide. Someone like him had no right to do such things. Did a title alone truly give the Emperor the right to remain at Adele's side? That thought lingered heavily in his chest. Suddenly, Adele softly called his name. In a weak voice, she asked him to sit closer. Even while barely conscious herself, she still looked at him with concern. During her feverish delirium earlier, Adele had wandered endlessly through darkness, desperately searching for Lionel again and again, and every time she cried out for help, he appeared, just like he always did. Whenever she saw him, the fear in her heart would quietly fade away. Adele asked the maids to leave the room, saying she wanted to speak with Lionel alone. Once they were finally alone, she quietly asked how long she had remained unconscious after destroying the tower. Lionel answered that it had been less than a day. Adele admitted she had overstrained herself by using such overwhelming magic. Still, if it helped save innocent lives, then she believed it had been worth the cost. In fact, she was certain Lionel would have made the same choice in her position. Listening to her words, Lionel suddenly realized that the people of Kotrov must have been utterly devastated to lose someone like Adele, someone willing to destroy herself just to save strangers. Eventually, Adele noticed how exhausted he looked and asked whether he had stayed awake all night. That was when Lionel finally told her about the assassination attempt that happened while she was unconscious. Even now, he still suspected Lennox's involvement. However, this attack had been far more organized and carefully executed than the previous one, leading Lionel to believe the Duke himself was most likely behind it this time. Bitterly, he admitted that the assassin once again committed suicide before they could properly interrogate her. Then he apologized for failing to uncover the truth. If the Duke truly orchestrated everything, obtaining solid proof would be extremely difficult. But Adele simply shook her head. What mattered most was that the assassination attempt had failed. Then, with genuine sincerity, she quietly thanked Lionel for protecting her.